Hey guys, tonight we slip under the scratchy woolen sheets of Tudor England. Not that you'll be getting cozy. You're lying on a lumpy straw mattress, surrounded by icy stone walls that seem to sigh with dampness. A single candle flickers beside you, its wax dripping onto the uneven wooden floorboards. Somewhere in the distance, someone coughs, then mutters a prayer. It's not romance that stirs this cold bedchamber. It's obligation, duty, and just a little fear. And tonight's story, let's just say, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing that little constellation of night owls out there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a grand manor, or maybe a cramped cottage. Either way, it's winter, and that wind, sneaking under the door, feels like it has teeth. In Tudor England, central heating is a laughable fantasy. Instead, your only defences against the chill are layered linens, a scratchy wool blanket, and the thin body heat of whoever shares your bed. Not that it helps. The hearth is out, the stones underfoot are like icy sponges, and every breath leaves a puff in the air. Romance? That froze about 10 minutes ago. You might think people snuggled close for intimacy. That's adorable. In reality, they did it to not die of exposure. Large families and even guests often shared beds, not out of affection, but survival. Your in-laws might be under the same blanket. And there's a goat in the corner, because why not? That's warmth too. Now let's talk beds. These aren't your plush memory foam wonderlands. Most are just wooden frames stuffed with straw, often mouldy and riddled with lice. If you're fancy, maybe you have a feather mattress. But if you're fancy, you're also wearing 10 layers of embroidered nightclothes, which take 20 minutes to remove, not exactly an invitation for spontaneous anything. And speaking of clothing, forget slipping into something more comfortable. The Tudors didn't do pajamas like we think of them. Nightshirts and long caps were standard. You're practically a ghost in muslin, and you keep it on, not because of modesty, although that's certainly a factor, but because it is cold. Stripping down is a punishment, not a prelude. Now imagine trying to be vulnerable, affectionate, or, heaven forbid, playful in these conditions. Your nose is running, your toes are numb, and there's a very real chance of getting a splinter from the bed frame if you move too fast. The only things you're likely to feel tonight are discomfort and mild resentment. That's if you even get the bed to yourself. Most commoners shared sleeping quarters with multiple family members, servants, or apprentices. Privacy? Never heard of her. The upper class might have private chambers, but those were rarely private either. Servants lurked behind tapestries, and courtiers might burst in with a message from the king at any hour. Even Queen Elizabeth complained about constant interruptions in her personal space, and she was the queen. And of course, let's not forget the soundscape of a Tudor bedroom. Floorboards creaked like moaning spirits, mice scampered behind walls, and that goat in the corner snored like an old uncle. Windows rattled, owls hooted, and your upstairs neighbour, if you had one, was probably grinding grain or giving birth. Thin walls, zero insulation. So if you're picturing a candle-lit romantic moment, you might want to adjust the lens. You wouldn't be nibbling anyone's ear. You'd be swatting lice. You wouldn't be whispering sweet nothings. You'd be trying not to sneeze directly onto your partner's face. And yet somehow life went on. Families were made, babies born, even love letters written. People adapted, they always do. But the conditions didn't exactly help. They didn't set the stage for trust, affection, or safety. Instead, they made intimacy something you endured, like taxes or Lent. One historical fact most don't realize is that the average Tudor home had no hallways. Rooms just led into one another. That meant if you wanted to get to the kitchen, you might walk right through your aunt's bedroom, or someone else might walk through yours. There was no concept of closed door equals privacy. Doors were mostly symbolic, and sometimes didn't even exist. Quirky tidbit for you. In some noble homes, bed curtains were not for sexiness, they were for warmth and for stopping spiders from dropping onto your face in the night. Ah yes, nothing says romance like arachnid defense, and historians still argue whether the average Tudor person even expected intimacy to be enjoyable. Was it duty, obligation, a religious ritual? Certainly not the subject of much open conversation. In letters and journals, even the rare glimpses of affection are guarded, coded, or buried in euphemism. If Shakespeare hadn't been around with his cheeky metaphors, we might never guess anyone smiled in bed at all. Still, people found ways to connect. Quiet glances by the hearth, shared apples, secret letters. But those small moments were precious, precisely because everything around them was so unhelpful. You're lying there now, right? Tucked under coarse blankets, listening to the drip of melted snow through the thatch above. The fire's long gone out. Your candle is a stub. And just before you drift off, you wonder, how did anyone manage to feel desired in a place that smells faintly of onions, goat, and damp wool? Simple. They didn't. They coped. They carried on. And every once in a while, despite the cold, the lice, and the echoing snores of the in-laws, they might have felt something close to closeness. You're still in that chilly Tudor chamber, only now imagine you've made it to the verge of something private. Just you and, well, not exactly solitude, because in Tudor England, privacy was a luxury you couldn't afford. Literally. Let's be clear, walls were thin, floors were hollow, and everything echoed. Whether you were in a country cottage or a royal palace, someone was always within earshot. You couldn't sneeze without someone 3 rooms away yelling, "Bless you," which sounds quaint until you realize that also applied to every creak of a bed frame or every breath that wasn't strictly for sleeping. The houses themselves weren't designed with intimacy in mind. You've got multiple people crammed into 1 or 2 rooms, often sleeping head to toe on the floor. If you were lucky, you had a wooden screen or a curtain to pull across your space. But let's be real, that's like closing your eyes and pretending no one else can see you. Even for the nobility, privacy was complicated. Sure, they had separate chambers, but separate is generous. Servants moved in and out constantly, tending fires, adjusting linens, and eavesdropping like it was their part-time job. There were no "do not disturb" signs, only court politics and the occasional locked door, and even then keys were communal. Want to get frisky? Good luck. There's a strong chance that the maid is stoking the fire 2 feet away, or that the footman just popped in to fetch your chamber pot. Picture trying to whisper sweet nothings with 3 other people folding laundry beside you. Not exactly a rom-com. Tudor beds themselves weren't soundproof sanctuaries either. Most creaked with the slightest movement, a sort of wooden alarm system that told everyone in the house you were up to something. You could try to move slowly, but remember, these were hand-hewn, uneven beams, not IKEA. Every joint was basically its own percussion section. And yes, even in the royal court, where you might assume the elite had more privacy, there was a surprisingly open approach to, well, everything. Courtiers often slept in the same room as monarchs, ladies-in-waiting lingered beside queens all night, and messengers delivered news at all hours. Henry VIII's chamber, for example, was a revolving door of advisers, grooms, and tailors. One historian even remarked that the king's bedchamber functioned more like a hallway with velvet sheets. Now here's a quirky detail. In some households, the idea of bundling was used, where 2 unmarried people could lie in bed together, but one or both would be sewn into a sack-like garment or tied up in a bundling board to prevent, shall we say, accidental intimacy. A Tudor sleepover with built-in chastity restraints. Delightful. Of course, that doesn't mean people didn't try, they just got creative. Lovers snuck out to haylofts, forest paths, or churchyards. Nothing says passion like trying to dodge a priest and a goose in the same 5 minutes. And occasionally, when they were caught, the consequences could range from public shaming to the stocks. One record describes a man being whipped around town for committing carnal acts in the presence of a stable boy, 4 hens, and a piglet. That's either a cautionary tale or a Monty Python sketch. Still, the lack of privacy didn't stop human nature. It just made it stressful. Every door creak, every shift under a blanket could signal doom. or at least a deeply awkward breakfast. You had to be quick, quiet, and not too attached to the idea of mood lighting. The glow from a fire, not sexy, its flickering soot and the smell of yesterday's mutton. And the emotional toll, real. Imagine trying to feel vulnerable when you know a cousin is asleep 2 feet away, or when the family dog has nestled itself between you and your spouse. Romance, at best, was utilitarian. At worst, it was a performance done with one eye on the curtain and one hand on the door latch. Historians still debate just how much this lack of privacy influenced relationship. Did it foster closer emotional bonds because couples had to rely on stolen glances and whispered jokes? Or did it drive people apart, forcing intimacy into brief, nerve-wracking intervals that felt more like chores than connection? There's evidence for both. Some letters show genuine affection and longing, others read more like grocery lists with kisses tacked on the end. And of course, religion had its say. The church firmly believed that anything more than the bare minimum was excessive, pleasure, suspicious, too much touching, sinful, and doing it without a blanket, practically heresy. People internalized this, so even when they did find a sliver of alone time, they carried centuries of guilt like a second mattress. Which brings us to a fun visual. Imagine 2 Tudors trying to whisper romantic nothings, but instead they're quoting scripture at each other out of habit. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife. I am thy wife. Oh, carry on then. All of this turned intimacy into a stealth operation. No candles, no noise, and certainly no singing. Yes, that was a real rule in some households. Singing in bed was seen as indecent, unless it was a hymn. So if you had to hum, you better choose something like Greensleeves and not Come Again, Sweet Love Doth Now Invite, which was basically the 1500s version of a Marvin Gaye track. So here you lie again, back in your Tudor bed. It's dark, your breath is fogging the air, and your neighbour just rolled over and murmured in his sleep. You're wrapped in 3 layers of wool and 1 layer of anxiety. Someone might barge in any moment asking if you've seen the ladle. The candle's gone out. You've forgotten what warmth feels like. And yet, you listen. You hear your partner's soft breathing, the rustle of linen, the familiar creak of the bed frame, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Not privacy, but presence. Not passion, but comfort. The kind that says we're here, still breathing despite it all. You're still awake, aren't you? Not surprising. Tudor beds weren't made for sleep, let alone relaxation. And tonight, something else itches beneath your linen. Not just the hay poking through the mattress, but the quiet horror of Tudor hygiene. Let's peel back the sheets, gently. Because what lies beneath isn't perfume and rose petals. It's wool, sweat, and centuries of poor decisions involving soap made from lye, ashes, and occasionally animal fat. If you're lucky. The Tudors didn't bathe daily, or weekly, or even monthly in some cases. Bathing was viewed with suspicion, especially after outbreaks of plague were linked, wrongly, to open pores and warm water. Some physicians advised against full baths entirely, believing they weakened the body and opened it to disease. Instead, people wiped their hands and faces with damp cloths. Think of it as a medieval baby wipe routine, just with more fleas. The result? Intimacy was an aromatic adventure, and not in a good way. Imagine leaning in for a kiss and being greeted not by the scent of roses but by pickled herring breath and a hint of unwashed wool. It wasn't personal, it was just normal. Let's talk clothing because it didn't help. A typical Tudor outfit involved multiple layers, a linen shirt, woolen stockings, perhaps a doublet or gown. These weren't changed daily, or, again, weekly. Underwear was often just a long linen shirt, and washing it required hauling water from a well, boiling it over a fire, and scrubbing it on a board with ash or stale urine. So, you guessed it, people skipped the step. Quirky fact incoming: some nobles would change shirts daily but never bathe, believing that clean linen pulled the filth from their bodies. There's even a documented case of a courtier who changed his shirt 6 times a day and bathed once a year. Imagine thinking your undershirt was basically a full-body sponge. Delightful. And while perfumes existed, rosewater, lavender sachets, even crushed rosemary, they were usually applied over the stink, not in place of it. So instead of fresh spring dew, you ended up smelling like floral-scented goat. It was an era where masking odours meant everything short of carrying a sprig of mint under your nose like a Victorian mourner. Now imagine trying to build trust or tenderness with someone while itching from lice, sore from a tight wool bodice, and genuinely unsure whether that smell is them, the bedding, or the chamber pot tucked discreetly behind a curtain. Spoiler, it's all three. Historians still argue whether Tudor people noticed the smell. Some suggest they were nose-blind, raised among the odours of fire smoke, chamber pots, unwashed bodies, and barn animals. Others argue they did notice and complained about it in letters and sermons, but were too poor or too constrained by custom to do much about it. Let's go back to your bed. You've just finished hauling water all the way from the stream to rinse your feet. That water, by the way, was also used to wash dishes, laundry, and occasionally pigs, and now you've wrapped yourself in 3 layers of still damp wool and slid into a bed that's maybe been shared by 4 people before you, still feeling romantic. And yet people found workarounds. They chewed cloves to freshen breath. They rinsed their mouths with vinegar. They plucked armpit hair to reduce odour. Some women dabbed behind their ears with lemon juice. Were these effective? Not entirely, but they were hopeful gestures, a bit like spraying cologne on top of last night's campfire jacket. And we can't ignore the hair. Men oiled it with animal fat, giving them that sleek, if slightly matted, look. Women rarely washed their long tresses, instead brushing and braiding them into submission. Lice combs were common and shared, and largely ineffective. Fun fact, it was considered romantic to give your beloved a louse comb as a token of affection, because nothing says, "I care," like helping someone delouse their scalp by candlelight. And when it came time for actual intimacy, let's just say it required resolve. Undressing wasn't sexy, it was exhausting. You had to untie, unlace, unbutton, and unravel several layers while still trying to be quiet enough not to wake the in-laws or the chickens. By the time you got to skin, the moment might have passed, or frozen. Not to mention, skin itself was complicated. Rashes were common, sores, boils, pox. Nobody had neosporin, let alone a dermatologist. If your partner had a suspicious lump or sore, you might chalk it up to bad humours and hope for the best. And still, people fell in love. People risked shame, disease, and splinters just for a moment of closeness. They stitched notes into sleeves, they carved initials into trees, they kissed in doorways and held hands under cloaks, all while stinking to high heaven. So here you are again, lying under that stinking wool, trying not to scratch. Your feet are still cold, your neck itches. Someone in the next room just let out a long, satisfied snore, but someone beside you shifts a little closer, and for a moment, just one, your noses nearly touch. It smells like onion smoke and maybe a faint whisper of rose water, and somehow that's enough. You're still in bed, because where else would you be at this hour, deep in a world that smells faintly of wood smoke, cabbage, and effort? But now the candle's flame has curled lower, flickering over your partner's face, and it hits you. Intimacy in Tudor England wasn't about pleasure. It was about duty. Often painful, sometimes terrifying, and almost always expected. You were taught that marriage was not the end of your romantic journey. It was the beginning of your responsibilities. And none was more important than fulfilling the marriage debt, a charming euphemism that meant having sex, whether you felt like it or not. It was your godly obligation, right up there with paying taxes and not stealing your neighbour's goose. Imagine you're a young Tudor bride. You've just survived a wedding ceremony that included vows, a feast, and enough ale to tranquilize a donkey. You're then escorted, sometimes paraded, into the bedchamber where a crowd might very well follow. And yes, this is real. Witnesses to consummation weren't uncommon among the noble or royal classes. You thought awkward wedding speeches were bad. There you are, barely out of childhood in some cases, facing a man twice your age. You're in pain from the corset, confused by the layers of fabric, and burdened with vague warnings from your mother about duty and submission. Meanwhile, The man, also bewildered but likely emboldened by ale and expectation, is just as anxious to perform. It's not seduction, it's not even foreplay, it's ceremony, obligation, and sometimes coercion. And if you're thinking, oh well, at least they could take their time, think again. Beds were shared, candles were short-lived, curtains were thin. The goal was speed and efficiency, not connection or comfort. You weren't there to be desired, you were there to produce heirs. One mainstream fact: canon law required that spouses not withhold sex from one another, lest the other fall into temptation. This created a power dynamic where saying no wasn't just frowned upon, it could be framed as ungodly. Husbands could be reprimanded in church courts for not sleeping with their wives, but the reverse was rarely enforced. Guess who that favored? Historians still debate how much women internalized this. Were they resigned, terrified, or did they believe they were honoring divine roles? Some records show women pleading for help, saying they dreaded the marriage bed, describing pain, fear, and shame. Others, particularly among the elite, played along publicly, but wrote biting poetry and sharp letters in private. One noblewoman referred to her husband as that hasty gardener, which is both tragic and admittedly hilarious. Now let's look at childbirth as a consequence. It wasn't a joy, it was a risk. Every time you went to bed with your husband, you risked 9 months of swelling exhaustion and a very real chance of dying in a dark room surrounded by weeping midwives. And contraception, sparse and unreliable. Women whispered about herbs like pennyroyal and rue, but using them was both dangerous and illegal. Some simply prayed, others avoided intimacy entirely, feigning illness or retreating to visit ailing relatives more frequently than one might think. But refusal was complicated and often punished socially or worse. Let's not forget what the law had to say. Marital rape, not recognized. A husband had the legal right to sex. The only recourse for a woman who refused her husband consistently was annulment. And even that was tricky, but let's not paint with too broad a brush. Not every couple lived in horror. There were genuine partnerships. Tenderness existed. You find letters, especially among the merchant class, where husbands and wives write with affection, even humour. "I send these socks and kisses in equal number," one grocer wrote to his wife, which might be the most endearing line of the entire 16th century. And yet, even in these more loving unions, expectations loomed. Producing sons was critical. Failure to do so invited whispers, pressure, and sometimes outright replacement. Just ask Catherine of Aragon. Her inability to bear a male heir was used as Henry VIII's excuse to launch a reformation and a wife swap. Quirky tidbit: some Tudor men believed that lying on your left side during intimacy would help produce girls, while lying on your right would favour boys. We can safely say that didn't work, but the idea led to arguments over positioning that must have made everything that much more awkward. Now picture it. The candle is nearly out. The chill seeps in. You lie there, sore perhaps, uncertain. There's no pillow talk, no cuddling. One partner rolls away. The other stares at the ceiling, listening to a rat scuttle across the beam overhead. You don't feel empowered, you feel relieved. It's over. And maybe worried it'll be expected again tomorrow. You're not broken, you're just following the script your entire culture handed you. Still, some rebelled. Quietly, women banded together and shared stories of tricks, herbs, excuses. They whispered tips behind church pews and traded cloth charms stitched with secret herbs. Men, too, occasionally hesitated. Some were gentle, patient, confused by the harshness of the norms around them. But these were exceptions, not expectations. Historians still argue whether the grimness of Tudor intimacy was overblown by puritanical records, or whether the reality was even more miserable than we imagine. Diaries of the time are scarce, and the ones that do exist are often censored, euphemistic, or focused on male pleasure. The female perspective is a ghost, half visible between ink blots and church records, so you settle deeper into your straw-stuffed mattress. You're a time traveller in someone else's nightmare. The room is quiet again, save for the sound of your own breathing and the slow crackle of a dying log. You close your eyes, not in contentment but in surrender. The night is long, the expectations longer. But for now, at least, it's over. Until the next duty calls, the candle has guttered out now, leaving behind a puddle of wax and the faint smell of burnt wick. But you're still lying there, half awake, half frozen, when you feel a tickle of something worse than cold. Dread. Because you remember the metal contraptions whispered about in jest and fear. The infamous chastity belt. It's a legend that refuses to die. In your mind, you picture a rusted iron apparatus, buckled tight around some poor woman's waist, like a dungeon prop fused with misguided morality. But let's unravel that myth slowly, like a particularly unnecessary codpiece. The truth? Most chastity belts are now believed to be later inventions, Victorian fantasies made of anxiety and bad taste. The few belts displayed in museums today are largely discredited as forgeries or misinterpretations. There's little evidence that women actually wore them in the Middle Ages or Tudor period. Sorry, Monty Python. But the fear behind the belt, that was real. Society was obsessed with guarding female purity, especially if you were noble or, heaven help you, royal. The more important your bloodline, the more valuable your virginity. You weren't just a person, you were a vessel for alliance, legacy, and politics. So, while iron belts may have been fantasy, restraint was very real. Figurative belts took the form of overbearing chaperones, locked trunks of clothing, or endless warnings about the ruin of reputation. Daughters were monitored like crown jewels, and woe betide the one caught flirting too freely. Her honour, and by extension her family's, could be shattered by a rumour alone. In noble families, girls were often married off by 14 or 15, some even younger. Their worth was calculated by their wombs, their dowries, and their hymens. A particularly unnerving Tudor custom, the public bedding ceremony, where witnesses escorted the newlyweds to their chamber, sometimes staying long enough to hear, shall we say, confirmation of the deed. You know, just to make sure the alliance stuck. And if the girl didn't bleed, trouble. People expected a blood-stained sheet to prove consummation. It was less about biology and more about optics. Midwives were sometimes bribed to stage the evidence. One tale tells of a goose's neck being used. Let's not dwell on that one. So no one strapped their daughters into iron underpants, but their minds and movements were buckled tight with expectation, shame, and fear. Now, if you're thinking, surely men weren't subjected to the same scrutiny, you are correct. Male chastity was mostly a joke. A man's flirtation was boisterous, his affairs unfortunate, his illegitimate children complicated. But a woman's indiscretion, that was sin, scandal, and sometimes a death sentence. Here's a quirky fact. Some betrothed couples were encouraged to sleep in the same bed before marriage, as long as they kept their clothes on. This practice, called bundling, involved the couple being sewn into separate sacks or separated by a board. The idea was to foster closeness without temptation, which is adorable, naive, and statistically doomed. Even the church had a complicated stance. On one hand, they extolled virginity as holy and ideal. On the other, they needed people to marry and make more parishioners. So a young woman was taught to guard her virtue, right up until the exact moment she was told to surrender it forever. Historians still argue whether chastity was genuinely prized or simply a tool of control. Did people believe in its moral superiority, or did they just fear the fallout of non-compliance? Evidence points both ways. Personal letters show girls begging to avoid marriages. Others express pride in saving themselves, likely out of both piety and survival instinct. But chastity wasn't always about abstaining. Sometimes it was about pretending. Courtly love poems dripped with veiled desire, all couched in metaphors about swans and roses. A woman could be a maiden in public and a lover in private, if she was careful, clever, and very, very lucky. And when women weren't lucky, that's when the whispers began. A belly too round, a laugh too loud, a trip to the apothecary too frequent. The consequences ranged from shame to exile to, in rare but terrifying cases, execution. Tudor England didn't joke about virtue, except when they did. Because, of course, bawdy humour flourished. Songs, plays, even sermons were full of sexual innuendo. It was a strange dichotomy. Shame on the streets, smirks in the alehouse. One minute you're told to save your soul, the next you're humming a tune about a baker's daughter and a sticky bun. Let's not ignore the fashion. Corsets and bodices emphasized a woman's figure while simultaneously signaling restraint. Skirts grew wider, sleeves heavier. The more fabric, the more virtue, supposedly. But underneath it all, people were still people. Curious, hungry, restless. So imagine now lying in your Tudor bed, fully dressed beneath the covers, trying to guess whether the person beside you is thinking about theology or just quietly panicking about whether their mother heard that floorboard creak. It's a world where your body isn't really yours. It's your family's reputation, your parish's morality tale, a contract, a symbol, a liability. And yet amidst all this, people still found pockets of rebellion, girls who carved initials into tree bark, boys who traded ribboned locks of hair, midwives who winked and whispered, "Maybe just lie still and say you did." You're drifting now, the darkness heavy around your eyelids. Somewhere in the room, a mouse noses through crumbs on the floor. The wind outside rattles the shutter. And just before sleep comes, you wonder, if you had been born into that time, would you have been able to love anyone freely, or would love have been just one more thing sewn shut with string? The shutters moan as the wind slips past them again, and in that creaky lull, you're reminded of the rituals that surrounded every whisper of touch in Tudor England. Because here's the thing, getting married didn't guarantee getting left alone. Not if your purity was under scrutiny, and certainly not if you had royal blood. You shift under the covers and recall how virginity wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a public performance. And no, that's not an exaggeration. Let's take a quiet stroll into the world of virginity checks and royal inspections. Imagine you're a young noblewoman betrothed to a foreign prince. Your marriage is political, your dowry substantial, and your family's honour stitched delicately into the hem of your wedding gown. Before the alliance is sealed, representatives, often midwives or noblewomen trusted by the court, might be dispatched to examine you, not medically, ceremonially, symbolically, uncomfortably. These so-called virginity tests were rarely scientific and often humiliating. They relied on vague, anatomical expectations and social theatre. A flushed face, suspicious, hesitation, damning, evidence, optional. There's a recorded case in the French court where a noblewoman's smile during questioning was taken as proof of guilt, because apparently only the experienced dare smile. And if you think this didn't happen in England, think again. Tudor royalty lived in a goldfish bowl of gossip, scandal, and ceremonial oversharing. Take Anne of Cleves, Henry the Eighth's fourth wife. He annulled their marriage, claiming she wasn't as described. Historians still debate whether this was a matter of virginity, attraction, or sheer political backpedaling. But the implication that her body had somehow deceived him, that she was damaged goods. Now, zoom out to everyday women. They weren't subjected to royal scrutiny, but that didn't mean they were spared. A girl accused of sleeping with a man before marriage might be dragged before her parish to confess. If pregnant, she could be forced to name the father publicly, under threat of excommunication or worse, social exile. And for women trying to prove virginity, it wasn't any easier. Some turned to folk remedies to restore the appearance of chastity, herbal poultices, tight bandages, and even blood capsules made from chicken parts. It's equal parts tragic and bizarre, a performance of pain just to be left in peace. Quirky tidbit, some bridal sheets were dyed or embroidered with red, just in case. That way, any evidence of consummation could be staged if needed, because in Tudor England, even your laundry could be part of a lie. And then there's the notion of public bedding ceremonies. Picture this. After a lavish wedding feast, the newlyweds are escorted to their bedchamber by an entourage of family, clergy, and courtiers. Jokes are made, songs are sung, and someone might throw a shoe for good luck. The couple is tucked into bed, literally, and left to complete the union. In some cases, trusted witnesses stayed close enough to hear the act. Occasionally, sheets were examined the next morning. In a few ghastly tales, a servant was even present in the room. Not exactly the honeymoon suite. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or exaggerated by later writers. Some believe the most invasive customs were limited to royalty. Others suggest local parishes may have practiced their own versions of marital verification. Regardless, the fear was real enough that people planned for it, joked about it, and dreaded it. Now let's take a breath and peek into the role of the midwife. She wasn't just present at birth. She was often involved in virginity inspections, verifying pregnancies, and even testifying at trials involving infidelity or assault. Her word carried weight, and yet she herself was always under suspicion. Too much knowledge about the female body. Witch. Not enough. Incompetent. A tightrope. Always. You curl tighter under the wool, imagining a world where your body isn't just yours, but a canvas for public commentary, where privacy is a privilege you don't have, and silence is interpreted as guilt, or worse, consent. And men? They weren't inspected the same way, but they weren't free of performance pressure either. A man unable to do his duty could face humiliation, annulment, or even public mockery. There are records of impotence trials where the accused husband had to demonstrate his abilities in front of officials or risk losing his marriage and honor. One court record describes such a test involving 3 matrons and a local priest. Spoiler. It didn't go well, you're probably wondering. How did people endure this? The truth is, quietly. They whispered, they prayed, they obeyed. They laughed behind closed doors and wept into their pillows. Some rebelled, some ran. Most simply, conformed. Because the consequences of standing out were often worse than the shame of giving in. And yet, amidst all this surveillance and spectacle, you still find letters, real human letters. A bride writing to her betrothed, "My fingers itch to hold thine." A husband reassuring his young wife, "I shall not be hasty, but wait thy word." Even in a world obsessed with proof, there were still hints of patience, of listening. So here you are, blinking in the dark, tracing the edge of a scratchy blanket with your thumb. Outside, the wind mutters secrets through the trees, and inside you wonder what it must have felt like to be examined like an object, doubted like a liar, and still hope for something soft, something warm, something real. Maybe you'd have written your own letter, maybe just one line slipped into a prayer book. Let me be loved without question. The coals in the hearth have long since dulled to ash, and the cold is creeping up your spine again, alongside a whisper of unease. Because in Tudor England, once the wedding was done, once the chamber was quiet, and once the evidence had been confirmed, the real anxiety began. Not about love, not even about pregnancy, but about how not to get pregnant again too soon, which leads us to the delicate, desperate world of herbal contraception and whispered prayers. Now there were no little pills in tidy foil packets, no latex tucked discreetly in coat pockets. In fact, contraception was neither convenient nor entirely legal. The church viewed it with suspicion, sometimes even as a sin against God's plan, and God's plan as interpreted by Tudor society involved women producing as many children as their wombs could handle, or rupture under. But women weren't passive. They were observant, inventive, and quietly networked. Over cups of ale, while grinding spices, or during walks to the village well, they exchanged knowledge, carefully coded, heavily cloaked in euphemism, but real. The midwife knew it. The herbalist hinted at it. Your aunt might slip you something in a cloth pouch and say, "Take this with warm beer before the moon turns." One mainstream method involved pennyroyal, an herb both common and dangerous. When steeped into tea, it could encourage menstruation or, in modern terms, act as an abortifacient. The dosage was a gamble. Too little, and it did nothing. Too much, and it could cause vomiting, organ damage, or death. Other herbs included rue, savory, and juniper berries, all believed to cleanse or cool the womb. Of course, none of this was foolproof, not even close, but it was better than nothing in a world where childbirth was as feared as the plague. Women didn't just fear pregnancy, they feared the consequences of pregnancy, the physical pain, the social judgment, and the very real possibility of dying in a dark room surrounded by weeping relatives and a clergyman. Now, if herbs didn't work, or if you couldn't get them, you turned to timing. Folk wisdom abounded. Some believed intimacy during a full moon led to girls, and during a new moon, to boys. Others thought conception was impossible if the woman sneezed afterward. Some advised jumping up and down. Others suggested drinking wine soaked in beaver testicles. Don't ask where they got those. Historians still argue how widespread this folk medicine was. Some scholars think it was limited to rural villages and passed through oral tradition only. Others believe even the urban elite dabbled in such knowledge, just behind locked doors and with a silver spoon. And yet, despite all these efforts, contraception remained deeply secretive. No one advertised, no one bragged. To possess this knowledge was to be seen as dangerous, even subversive. A woman who knew too much about her own body could be accused of witchcraft. In fact, midwives were often the first women targeted during moral panics, not because of actual spells, but because of what they knew about herbs, cycles, and hidden wounds. Quirky tidbit. There was a belief that tying a frog's leg around a woman's thigh would prevent pregnancy. Why? Because the frog symbolized fertility, and apparently confusion. You can't help but imagine a woman clutching a sachet of crushed rue, hoping it works, praying it doesn't kill her. Or another slipping a sprig of mint into her wine, not for flavor, but because her neighbor swore it cooled the fire within. The fire, of course, being the ever-looming threat of motherhood, again, because childbirth wasn't a single trauma. It was expected to happen over and over again. A noble woman might bear 12 children. A poor woman, even more, though few of them survived. The average Tudor woman spent half her life either pregnant, nursing, or mourning. And if a woman admitted she didn't want children, scandalous. That was like saying you didn't want rain to fall or bread to rise. Your entire value was tied to your reproductive usefulness. To reject that was to reject the very core of Tudor womanhood. Even among married couples, intimacy was supposed to result in children. Pleasure was a luxury. If you were caught using contraception, even ineffective ones, you could be fined or shamed in church. There were sermons about it, fire and brimstone, all for a few berries and a desperate wish. So what did women do? They pretended, they lied. They said they had a headache or that it was a holy day. Some faked illnesses, others slept apart. And when all else failed, they lit a candle, clutched their charms and whispered to saints, herbs and shadows. And when the herbs failed and the signs appeared and the stomach swelled, then came another layer of prayer. Not for avoidance, but for survival. You lie there now, under scratchy blankets, feeling the weight of that fear. The sense that your body isn't your own. That every shared moment might lead to blood, pain and judgment. That the softest connection carries the hardest consequences. But even in that fear there is defiance. The passing of a pouch, a coded glance across the market. The village woman who winks as she hands over a bundle of herbs and says, "Steep it strong and don't tell your husband." Because even in Tudor England resistance bloomed in quiet places. The embers are barely glowing now, and outside the wind howls like a hungry thing. You shift beneath your woolen blankets, your body stiff with the weight of the world you've been dropped into, one where intimacy is tangled in superstition, shame, and the moon's silent pull. Tonight that pull leads us into the hazy realm of midwives, myths, and moon cycles. You see, in Tudor England, fertility wasn't science, it was folklore, passed from mother to daughter, from village healer to hesitant bride, carried on whispers and wildflower sachets. There were no gynecologists, no ovulation trackers, no neat little apps with pink icons. There was the moon, there were herbs, there was timing, and a whole lot of guesswork. Midwives were the gatekeepers of this knowledge. They weren't just women who caught babies, they were the walking libraries of birth lore, fertility charms, and menstrual mystery. Some were revered, some were feared, Most lived in the fragile space between healer and heretic. If you were trying to get pregnant or trying not to, you went to the midwife. She might feel your pulse, examine your urine, or tie a red ribbon around your wrist and ask you what dreams you'd had lately. It sounds quaint, even charming, but for Tudor women, these visits were soaked in tension. The stakes were high, and air meant security. A barren womb meant whispers. Mainstream Tudor belief tied a woman's fertility to the moon's cycle. Menstruation was sometimes referred to as the moon's curse, and women were thought to be most fertile when the moon waxed full. Entire calendars were arranged around lunar phases, not for gardening, but for guessing at the right time to conceive. Want a boy? Conceive under a waxing moon. Want a girl? Wait for it to wane. Want twins? Well, good luck. Even the midwives didn't have a charm for that one, unless you count pray a lot and hope. Quirky tidbit? Some believed that a woman could influence the sex of the baby by what she looked at during conception. Gaze upon something beautiful, get a pretty child. Look at a horse? Well, may your child be strong, I suppose. Beyond the moon, midwives used a mix of herbs, amens, and rituals to help women conceive. They might burn mugwort and have you breathe the smoke. They might boil parsley in wine and tell you to drink it while reciting the Lord's Prayer. Backward, yes, backward. Good luck getting that right after 2 cups of spiced ale. Historians still argue about how much of this was genuine belief and how much was ritual comfort. Did people believe the moon actually caused pregnancy? Or was it a way to feel like they had some control in a world full of unknowns? The line is blurred, maybe deliberately so. Faith and science weren't separate realms. They shared a bed, uneasy as it was. Even astrology had a role. Some midwives charted birth predictions based on planetary alignments. A child born under Mars might be brave, under Saturn, melancholic. The star charts didn't just guide births, they sometimes decided when couples should try to conceive. If Venus was in the wrong house, try again next month, or not at all. But the midwife wasn't just about beginnings. She was the guardian at the gates. She presided over births, miscarriages, secret herbal remedies, and the final quiet prayer over a still infant. She was often the one who first noticed when a woman was late, and the one asked to fix it, discreetly, quietly, sometimes dangerously. And yet, for all their knowledge, midwives lived under constant suspicion, because they knew things about blood, about bodies, about sex, that made them powerful. And in Tudor England, power in the hands of women made people nervous. One whisper of a failed pregnancy, and the midwife might be blamed. One birth with complications, and she could be accused of witchcraft. Some were hanged, others exiled, and some, wisely, stayed silent. Still they passed on their secrets, a knot tied under the pillow, a song hummed during labour, a special brew steeped under moonlight. Knowledge carried not in books, but in fingers, stained with herbs and eyes that had seen too much. You lie there now, imagining the flicker of firelight across a midwife's wrinkled hands. She's mixing something in a wooden bowl, a root, a leaf, a whisper. You've come to her not because you understand, but because you hope. She doesn't promise miracles. She gives you a bundle of dried yarrow and says, "Hang it above your bed, love, and keep your feet warm." The womb listens. You don't question it, because in this world, that's the best advice you're going to get. And as you drift, you think of all the women before you, clutching charms, squinting at the moon, counting days on a slate. They weren't foolish. They were reaching, trying to pluck a little agency from the heavens, because when your future depended on blood, stars, and whether a midwife said yes or no, it wasn't science. It was survival, lit by moonlight. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster lets out a confused croak. It's not quite dawn, not quite night, the kind of hour where things slip between reality and nightmare. And in Tudor England, one of those nightmares wore a grin. A disarming, sometimes charming, often fatal grin. Because tonight you're meeting a companion no one invited into their bed, but many unknowingly did. Syphilis, or, as the Tudors called it, the French pox. Now, before you feel too smug with your modern antibiotics and clever packaging, understand that in the 16th century this disease was terrifyingly new. It arrived in England around the 1490s, right on the heels of exploration, conquest, and cross-continental mingling. Its symptoms were gruesome, its spread was rapid, and its reputation scandalous. You might wake one morning with a small sore, nothing dramatic, just an odd patch. Weeks later, fevers, rashes, headaches, and swollen glands followed. Then came the terrifying third act: madness, blindness, flesh falling away. The Tudors had no idea how it worked. They thought it might be caused by bad air, too much hot food, or astrology. Honestly, astrology got blamed for a lot back then. They didn't call it syphilis, of course. They called it the French disease, unless you were French, in which case you called it the Neapolitan disease. The Spanish blamed the Portuguese, the Germans blamed the Poles, and everyone somehow blamed women, especially prostitutes. Which brings us to the bedchambers of taverns, brothels, and dim alleys, places where desire met desperation, and no one asked questions. If you were poor, lonely, or unlucky, the stews of Suffolk offered a brief, often risky, escape. It was here that syphilis sank in its hooks, hiding behind a smile, a coin, or a careless kiss. Mainstream medical remedies? Utterly bonkers. One popular treatment was mercury, yes, that mercury, rubbed into sores, sniffed as powder, or boiled and inhaled in steam baths. The thinking was, poison the poison. In reality, patients were just poisoning themselves faster. A night with Venus, the saying went, a lifetime with Mercury. And if that didn't work, there was always bloodletting, pigeon poultices, and something called sweating therapy, where patients were wrapped in blankets and placed near roaring fires until they passed out. Let's just say the recovery rate wasn't inspiring. Quirky tidbit. Some physicians believed that wrapping yourself in the skin of a freshly slaughtered chicken could draw out the infection. We'll give you a moment to visualize that. Not very sexy. Syphilis was particularly feared because it disfigured the face. Lesions, collapsing noses, and sunken cheeks gave victims a haunted look. To cover the damage, sufferers wore masks, veils, or heavy white makeup, often made from lead. Yes, lead. So now you're dying and glowing like a cursed porcelain doll. Historians still argue whether the disease affected the political landscape. Did Henry VIII suffer from syphilis? Some suggest yes, pointing to his erratic moods, leg ulcers, and inability to father healthy children late in life. Others say no, attributing his decline to obesity and injury. The truth remains murky, like most things wrapped in royal secrecy. What's certain is this: fear of the pox changed behavior. People became more secretive. Whispers replaced winks. A young man might think twice before sneaking off to the stews. A married woman might check her husband's skin with a nervous glance. Physicians started publishing warning pamphlets, complete with woodcuts of melting faces and bloated limbs. But the disease didn't stop intimacy. It just made it quieter, sadder, sometimes cruel. Men accused their wives of infidelity when sores appeared, ignoring their own visits to the brothel. Women bore the burden of shame even when they were the victims. And yet, people kept seeking connection, out of loneliness, out of hope, out of habit. Because what's more human than touching another person, even in a world that tells you not to? You roll over, imagining the scratch of a wool sheet against a rash-covered shoulder, the awkward glance across a dark room, the sigh of someone who knows they might have made a mistake, but also knows it's already too late. And then there's the silence that follows, the kind only broken by the doctor's arrival, holding a jar of mercury and a prayer. You breathe in the cold, grateful for modern medicine, yes, but also filled with a strange, sleepy awe for those who lived through that time, who kissed and loved and risked everything without knowing why it hurt so much to smile 3 weeks later. Because in Tudor England, sex didn't just carry the risk of shame. It could kill you slowly in layers while your neighbors whispered and your nose disappeared. Sleep tight. You stir slightly as the chill deepens, and the sound of distant bells tolls faintly in the wind, An eerie reminder that in Tudor England, death was always close, even in the most intimate of moments. Because if it wasn't syphilis that came calling, it might just be something faster, stranger, and more elusive. Sweating sickness, or as some called it, the stop-dead fever. Imagine this. You've just spent an evening wrapped in someone else's warmth, shared a cup of spiced ale, laughed a little too loud, maybe even pulled the bed curtains shut, but in the morning, a hot flush, a sudden headache. Within hours, you're drenched in sweat, gasping and shaking so violently you can't hold a spoon. You're not alone. Your lover, your cousin, your tailor, they're all sick too. Some are already gone. Sweating sickness wasn't picky. It struck rich and poor alike, often after festivals, court gatherings, or, yes, moments of intimacy. Historians now suspect it may have been a form of hantavirus, but in the 16th century it seemed to appear out of nowhere, fast, invisible, and terrifyingly lethal. Entire households collapsed within a day. You went to bed laughing and never got back up. It became especially notorious in 1491 and again in 1528 when it hit Henry VIII's court so hard that the king fled, riding from palace to palace, abandoning his mistresses and advisers as he searched for somewhere, anywhere, disease-free. He was obsessed with it, terrified of it. And can you blame him? In some towns, the connection between physical closeness and outbreak became impossible to ignore. Couples who had recently bundled or been married were often among the first to fall ill. Beds were burned, linens buried, midwives refused to enter infected homes. The implication? That sex, not sinfully, but simply through shared breath and skin, could be a death sentence. And people began to wonder if perhaps it wasn't just illness, but punishment. After all, hadn't the priests warned them? And so more layers of superstition grew. Some believed that engaging in intimacy on holy days made you more susceptible. Others insisted that women who had just given birth were open to spirits, and therefore more vulnerable. And some whispered about ghosts, those who had died mid-passion returning to claim their lovers. The Tudors had no shortage of imaginative explanations. Quirky detail. One pamphlet warned men to avoid warm meat, new brides, and dancing before noon, claiming the combination opens the humours to sweating and death. Sounds like your average bachelor party gone wrong. People tried everything to avoid it, tying herbs around their necks, sleeping with knives under their pillows, smearing onions on their skin. One woman in Kent reportedly slept upright in a barrel for a month to avoid the sweat crawling into her pores. And yet, for all their effort, the disease struck without pattern or pity. It could come during a moment of joy, a stolen kiss, a shared goblet. One moment you were flushed with laughter, the next with fever. Historians still debate its cause. Some say rodents, others say water. A few believe it was mass hysteria made real by fear. But one thing is clear, the intimacy of bodies, the gathering of warmth in cramped spaces, was always the setting. Imagine the emotional toll. You fall for someone you dare to love, or at least desire. And then they're gone, taken in an afternoon. Their sweat still damp on your bedclothes, their scent still clinging to your neck. And the grief, private. You couldn't mourn too loudly lest neighbours avoid your house or accuse you of bringing the sickness. So lovers became ghosts. Their names were whispered only behind closed doors, their stories lost in church records labelled sudden fever. But still people didn't stop. They couldn't. The drive for connection, for warmth, was too strong, even when the risk hovered like a fog, even when priests warned that death came for the unchaste first, even when every cough felt like a countdown. You pull the covers tighter now, heart beating a little faster, not from fear, but from awe. Awe at how people kept reaching for each other in a world that kept trying to separate them with disease, shame, and superstition. How they held hands in the dark, even when that dark was filled with coughing and fever. Because what else was there? You can still hear the echoes, a couple dancing before the fire, not knowing it will be their last night. A woman brushing a lock of hair from her lover's brow, even as sweat beads on her own. A husband gripping his wife's hand while her breath shortens and her eyes glaze over. No one knew what caused it, but everyone feared it, and everyone eventually faced it. You're still lying here, centuries later, untouched by their fever but surrounded by their courage, their longing, their stubborn, shivering need to be close to someone, even as death knocked at the door. Sleep now. You're safe for tonight. The sky beyond your shuttered window has softened into a silvery pre-dawn, but you're still tucked into that cold Tudor bed where shadows flicker across heavy beams and the walls seem to breathe. You're warm, sort of, but not comfortable, because tonight your ribs are pinched, your lungs are compressed, and your heart is doing acrobatics trying to pump through cloth and whalebone. Yes, it's time to wriggle carefully into the world of Tudor fashion and how the very garments meant to flatter and impress also managed to bruise, bind, and completely sabotage any chance of spontaneous intimacy. Let's start with the bodice. Tight-laced, heavily boned, and often layered over stiffened stays, this wasn't some delicate silk number. This was body armour disguised as courtwear. A fashionable woman of the Tudor court might spend an hour being strapped into her outfit, pushed, pulled, padded and pinned, until her chest resembled a shelf and her waist a corseted sigh. But it wasn't just about aesthetics. Your appearance was a public declaration of virtue, wealth, and marital status. A neatly laced bodice suggested you were modest, disciplined, and fully under control by yourself or by someone else. And if you were hoping to remove it quickly, think again. There were no zippers, just dozens of laces, hooks, and knots, most of them positioned at the back. Dressing and undressing required assistance. So unless you brought a servant along on your romantic escapade, you weren't getting out of that gown without a fight. Or scissors. Men didn't fare much better. A well-dressed Tudor gentleman had to contend with doublets, trunk hose, ruffled collars, and sometimes even a padded codpiece. The goal wasn't comfort, it was status. The bigger your sleeves and the more velvet in your cloak, the more you screamed, "I have money," even if you couldn't breathe while doing it. One mainstream fact: many upper-class men wore stiffened linen shirts that reached their thighs and were tucked tightly under layers of wool. Add in woolen stockings tied up with garters and square-toed shoes, and you have a man fully committed to looking good, even if it meant peeling himself like an onion at bedtime. Now picture a couple, still half-dressed, trying to figure out how to be close without suffocating. The woman's ribcage is being compressed like an overstuffed pastry. The man's stockings are slipping, their collars are flaring out like startled pigeons, and the candle has burned low, giving them just enough time to wonder whether it's worth the effort. Historians still argue how much these fashion choices were practical versus performative. Were the tight bodices and stiff collars meant to physically restrict desire, or were they just the product of a culture obsessed with status and symmetry? Some believe the discomfort was the point, a visual reminder that self-control and appearance mattered more than ease or emotion, but fashion didn't just get in the way. Sometimes it enticed. A flash of ankle, a glimpse of silk chemise beneath a heavy gown. These small reveals became acts of boldness. Think of it as the Tudor version of an Instagram thirst trap. Except instead of filters, you had embroidery. Quirky tidbit? Women sometimes scented their underclothes with rosewater or clove-studded pomanders, tucked into pockets or pinned beneath skirts. Not because they thought anyone would smell them, but because they wanted to feel lovely despite the lice. And let's not forget the farthingale, a hooped petticoat that made skirts flare out like a spinning top. It created volume, elegance, and a personal force field of fabric that made getting close physically challenging. You didn't cuddle in a farthingale, you pivoted like a planet and hoped your intended was in orbit. Now, in taverns and peasant homes, clothes were simpler, but not much easier. Most people owned only a few garments, which they wore until threadbare. Washing was rare. Fastening them often required makeshift solutions, twine, pins, or even fish bones. Undressing wasn't sensual, it was work. Which makes you wonder, how did anyone in any class manage to feel even vaguely alluring? The truth is, they probably didn't try to be. Not in the modern sense. Desire existed, yes, but it was channeled through whispers, glances, and carefully choreographed touches during a dance or a festival. And even then, once those layers started coming off, the illusion often collapsed with the clothing. Still, some made it work. Secret laces, gowns unlaced just enough. Lovers meeting with pre-loosened corsets and hastily removed garters. There are reports, rumoured of course, of noblewomen commissioning breakaway gowns that appeared proper, but could be swiftly undone in the right moment. Practical, if scandalous. You shift again, imagining the scratch of wool at your neck, the ache in your spine from tight stays, the awkward press of wooden toggles beneath your shoulder blades. And you can't help but admire the sheer determination it must have taken to pursue anything remotely romantic when your outfit was actively trying to prevent it. Because in Tudor England, fashion wasn't just vanity, it was obedience. It told the world who you were, what you were worth, and who you belonged to. But beneath the linen, the whalebone, the velvet and laces beat the same longing as ever, to be seen, touched, and wanted, if only someone could figure out how to undo all the knots. The light outside your window is beginning to grey, a pale mist curling past the glass, like a sigh held too long. But before the world wakes, let's stay right where you are, under the covers, face to face with one of the most powerful forces in Tudor England. Not plague, not politics, but something far more intimate and far more intrusive, the church. Because if you thought Tudor intimacy was already risky, restrictive and wrapped in wool, just wait until sin enters the picture. In Tudor times, sex was a spiritual battlefield, and nearly every thought, gesture, or whisper of desire was weighed against the possibility of eternal damnation. You were taught from childhood that the flesh was weak, that carnal pleasure was suspect, that even within marriage, yes, even there, too much enjoyment might be cause for confession, because remember, the purpose of sex wasn't love, it wasn't closeness, it certainly wasn't fun, it was procreation. Specifically, male procreation. That's not an exaggeration. Church doctrine emphasized that intimacy was only acceptable if it was A, between a married man and woman, B, intended to result in children, and C, performed in the missionary position, quietly and ideally without enthusiasm. You laugh, but that's real advice pulled from Tudor sermons and confessional guides. If you deviated from that, even slightly, you risked your soul. Clergy preached that every drop of misdirected seed was a sin. Women were taught to be submissive, not just socially, but spiritually. And if they were too passionate, that was considered unnatural, possibly demonic. Which brings us to a quirky and very real Tudor fear, the insatiable woman. Yes, they actually believed some women were cursed with such burning desire that it could not be satisfied by any one man. These women were viewed as dangerous, morally, physically, and even medically. Some doctors believed the uterus could wander the body, causing hysteria if left unvented. The church responded by urging fasting, cold baths, and confession. A lot of confession. People confessed to impure thoughts, to impure dreams, to touching themselves, to touching others, to thinking about touching others. One man was reportedly flogged for having wicked feelings about a dairymaid. There's no record of what the dairymaid thought. You might think the clergy would offer compassion. Often they did not. Public penance was common. You might be forced to walk barefoot through the village, wear a shame smock, or stand before your entire parish and list your sins aloud. Try coming back from that one. Historians still argue whether people truly internalized all this guilt, or whether they just learned to live with it. Some suggest people laughed privately, made bawdy jokes behind closed shutters, and reserved their true selves for the alehouse and the bedroom. Others argue that the church's grip on morality was so strong, so total, that guilt soaked into every aspect of daily life. Let's consider the timing. Certain days, Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, and about a dozen other holy observances were off-limits for marital relations. That's nearly half the calendar. Add in menstrual cycles, illness, travel, and family sharing the same bed, and you begin to see how few acceptable windows existed for even legitimate intimacy, which meant that when couples did engage, it was often hurried, hushed, and accompanied by a little prayer for forgiveness. That's right. Some guides suggested praying after intercourse as a sort of spiritual rinse. Forgive us, Lord, for that which was necessary but not altogether pure. Romance. And if someone stepped truly outside the lines, adultery, fornication, or anything vaguely experimental, the church courts were ready. Yes, church courts. A whole judicial system existed to handle these cases. Couples were summoned, questioned, and even punished based on rumors. A neighbor might accuse you, a servant might testify. Your marriage bed was never entirely yours. Fun fact, some churches had penance stools, furniture designed for sinners to kneel on facing the congregation while they publicly repented for carnal acts. Imagine being known in your village not as the cooper or the midwife, but as the person who got caught on the wrong side of a haystack. And still people rebelled, quietly, with winks, with coded songs, with dirty jokes scratched into pews. They resisted not by storming churches, but by carrying on, by loving despite the guilt, despite the sermons, despite the shame. There are records of husbands writing tender, almost apologetic notes to their wives. I know our union is duty, but let it also be delight. You can feel the tension between what they were told and what they felt. You shift again, picturing the flicker of candlelight on a stone church wall, the cold grip of pews, the deep, solemn voices singing psalms about fire and lust. And then the contrast of a couple whispering in bed, hearts pounding, aware that what they do might be sin, but also the only time they feel alive, because that's what the church couldn't fully extinguish: desire, the soft rebellion of wanting, of reaching, of believing that perhaps something sacred could exist in the space between two people, even if a sermon said otherwise. So tonight, under your layers of scratchy linen and faded dreams, you don't pray for forgiveness. You pray for understanding. And maybe, just maybe, for a Sunday exemption. The sky has barely lightened, but something in the air has changed. A stillness, a hush. You're warm now, but it's the kind of warmth that comes from tension, not comfort. Because in Tudor England, to be warm in the wrong bed could cost you everything, especially if that bed belonged to a king. Tonight we tiptoe through velvet corridors into the glittering and grim world of royal mistresses, women draped in jewels and silks who often ended up tangled in secrets, rumours, and sometimes the gallows. It sounds glamorous, doesn't it? To catch the king's eye, to be summoned to court, given gowns, horses, a private chamber, maybe even a title. But behind every gift was a contract, spoken or not. You belong to him now, for as long as he wants you, and not a moment longer. Take Elizabeth Blount, the first of Henry VIII's well-known mistresses. She bore him a son, Henry Fitzroy, who was promptly acknowledged and elevated. Sounds like a fairy tale, until you realise she was a teenager. And after the birth, she was quietly married off to a minor nobleman, as if she'd completed a temporary royal internship. Then there's Anne Boleyn, who began as a flirt, became queen, and ended up headless. Her story is well known, but easy to forget just how dangerous it was to be desired by the king. Every smile was a political move, every refusal a gamble, every childless month a ticking clock. Because here's the truth, the role of royal mistress was never just about affection, it was about power. The men around the throne saw mistresses as gatekeepers, tools, or threats. A favourite could influence appointments, sway legal decisions, or secure favours for her family. But the moment she overstepped, the whispers began. She was too proud, too bold, too French. And the church? It hated them. Priests railed against concubines in velvet. Sermons thundered that kings, no matter how anointed, had no right to keep multiple women under one roof. But kings rarely listened, especially Henry. Quirky tidbit? Henry V's court had a formal title for the king's favourite, the woman of most honour. No, seriously. As if a fancy phrase could baptise the arrangement in respectability. But the danger wasn't just court gossip, it was childbirth. If a mistress became pregnant, and many did, she risked everything. A healthy boy could bring favour, land, even a title. But a girl, or a stillbirth, or a scandal, that could mean exile, disgrace, or being married off to someone with a quiet estate far, far from court. And if the king tired of you, you were expected to vanish gracefully, without fuss. A tearful exit was fine, just don't make it public. Your replacement was already measuring the curtains. Historians still debate whether some mistresses sought the role or simply survived it. Were they social climbers or political pawns? Did they feel affection, resentment, or nothing at all? It depends. Some letters suggest real longing. Others read like resignation on parchment. The danger wasn't only emotional, it was legal. In some rare cases, mistresses were accused of witchcraft. Anne Boleyn's fall was laced with these rumours, potions, charms, seduction spells. The king's changing heart couldn't possibly be his fault. It had to be hers. And then there were the jealous queens, trapped in their own delicate balancing acts. Catherine of Aragon watched her husband dote on Elizabeth Blount. Anne of Cleves was rejected almost immediately after their wedding night. Catherine Howard, young, vulnerable, perhaps naive, paid with her life for past dalliances. In the game of Tudor court, queens were queens until they weren't. Even lesser-known mistresses faced peril. Their names rarely survive in history books, but their lives were often marked by scandal, forced marriages, and silence. A quick rise, a faster fall. You shift beneath your blankets, imagining yourself in their place, dressed in damask, surrounded by spies, forced to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to smile when you felt terrified. Your every word could be twisted, your loyalty questioned, and your fate determined not by love but by whims, because in Tudor England, to be the king's desire was to be his possession, beautiful, brief, and expendable. But still some played the game, and won, briefly. Some used the role to lift their families out of poverty. Some brokered marriages, claimed land, and ensured their children's futures. Some vanished into quiet estates with fat pensions and warm fireplaces. Others disappeared entirely, names scrubbed from records, portraits reattributed. And a few, they dared to fall in love. With the king, with someone else, with no one at all. And that may have been the most dangerous act of all. You lie back now, the imagined weight of a velvet gown pressing into your chest, and feel a strange ache, not for the jewels or the power, but for the quiet lives these women were never allowed to have. To be ordinary, to be anonymous, to kiss someone without wondering who's watching from the tapestry. The morning light is starting to glow behind the cloth-draped window, but the room is still hushed, still holding its secrets. And as you lie there, wrapped in scratchy linen and the scent of long-cooled ashes, you can almost hear the footsteps on cobblestones, the creak of old doors, and the murmurs of coin-changing hands. Because tonight's story wanders out of royal bedchambers and into the stews of Southwark, London's most infamous district of sin. Yes, the Tudor world of prostitution was messy, dangerous, occasionally regulated, and always deeply hypocritical. Let's start with the word stew. It didn't refer to a pot of soup, it meant a bathhouse, and eventually came to represent brothels more broadly. These stews lined the south bank of the Thames, just across from the heart of power. Westminster, Whitehall, and the Tower. How convenient. It's not as if they were hiding. Everyone knew where they were. Shakespeare even mentioned them, priests condemned them, poets winked at them, and men from every level of society, nobles, merchants, sailors, slipped through their doors nightly. In fact, the church itself once owned many of these stews. That's right. Until the mid-16th century, many brothels in Southwark operated under the loose jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester. The women who worked there were nicknamed Winchester geese, a bitter little joke and a not-so-subtle reminder of how power worked. One mainstream fact, although technically illegal, prostitution was tolerated in Tudor England, as long as it stayed within certain boundaries. Those boundaries, pay your fines, stay in your district, keep disease outbreaks just barely under control, but step out of line and punishment could be swift. Let's talk punishment. Women caught working outside the stews or without protection could be branded, whipped, or marched through the streets, wearing nothing but a smock and a sign reading their crime. Men, fined, if that. Sometimes they were let off with a warning and a wink. It won't surprise you to learn that the risk of disease was rampant. The French pox spread like spilled ink through the stews, and while some brothels tried to enforce cleanliness, boiling linens, using herbal washes, there was no such thing as safe sex, just slightly less dangerous sex. Quirky tidbit? Some brothels posted price lists outside their doors, etched on wooden boards. The fancier the woman's dress, the higher the cost. But looks could deceive. Makeup was often made from lead paste. Rouged cheeks meant health or an attempt to fake it. The women themselves came from hard paths. Some were orphans, some widows. Many were abandoned after falling pregnant, cast out of respectable society with no way to survive. Becoming a bawd or courtesan was rarely a first choice. But once in the life, getting out was nearly impossible. The average working girl had no protection, not from disease, not from violence, and certainly not from the law. Their landlords, clients, and even constables could exploit them. If a woman was attacked or robbed, she was unlikely to be believed. Her word didn't hold weight. Her reputation was already ruined. And yet some found ways to assert control. A few madams, usually former workers, ran their establishments with strict rules and surprising organization. They kept ledgers, managed rooms, and even refused clients who mistreated the women. These weren't just brothels, they were survival networks. Historians still argue whether Tudor society viewed these women with pity or contempt. Some records suggest a kind of weary tolerance, others show relentless cruelty. Church records are filled with efforts to reform fallen women, often involving forced labor, public shaming, or being locked away in workhouses. But if society hated them so much, why were their services always in demand? Because Tudor culture was riddled with contradiction. Sermons condemned lust, but plays made it hilarious. Officials closed stews by day and visited them by night. People feared the sins of the flesh, but refused to let them go. And so in Suffolk, the cycle continued. A woman in red stood in a window calling softly. A sailor climbed narrow stairs with a coin in hand. A girl stared at her reflection in a cracked mirror, wiping powder onto a sore and praying it wouldn't spread. You lie still, the air heavy with ghosts. You can almost hear the rustle of skirts, the creak of floorboards, the quiet cough of a tired voice saying, "Next." And you wonder, who mourned these women? Who remembered their names? Who saw them not as symbols or sins, but as people? There are records of some, letters left behind, notes scrawled in margins. A woman writing to her sister, "I still have dreams of spring and clean linen." Another scribbled in a prayer book, "God forgive me, I was only ever cold and hungry." Because behind every scandal was a person. Not wicked, holy, just tired, just surviving. And as the sky outside your room blushes pale blue, you curl deeper under the covers, thinking about those women who had no bed of their own, no curtains to draw, no dreams allowed. They worked in the dark, laughed when they could, and hoped, if only once, to be held without transaction. The early Tudor morning creeps in now, soft as breath on the back of your neck. You're still bundled tight beneath your blankets, but in your mind, you're climbing creaky stairs toward a narrow garret, candle in hand, careful not to knock over the chamber pot. Because in this chapter of Tudor life, you're about to confront one of the most unsung villains of intimacy, the relentless, awkward, ever-present inconvenience of Tudor living spaces. Yes, tonight it's all about chamber pots and interruptions. Now let's be clear, Tudor homes weren't spacious. Whether you lived in a thatched cottage or a townhouse over a London shop, rooms were small, ceilings were low, and walls were thin, if they existed at all. The concept of a private bedroom was a luxury few could afford. Most people shared rooms, often even beds, with family members, apprentices, or boarders. So if you were lucky enough to find a moment alone with your beloved, you'd be performing not a dance of seduction, but a strategic operation. You had to time it right. Between the servant finishing her tasks and your uncle returning from the tavern, between the baby's colic and your father's snoring, between the local bell ringer and the milk cart rattling past the shutters. And then the sound, not passion, not poetry, scrape. the unmistakable, mortifying scrape of someone dragging the chamber pot across the wooden floorboards in the dark. Because that's the thing, the Tudor bedchamber wasn't just a sleeping space, it was also a bathroom, not that you'd call it that. Chamber pots were clay, tin, or if you were very fancy, pewter. They sat under the bed or behind a curtain, and they didn't just hold the leftovers of last night's dinner. Oh no, they lingered. So imagine trying to lean in for a kiss when, behind you, someone's squatting over a noisy pot, whispering an apology and accidentally kicking your shoe. One mainstream fact, even noble houses often lacked indoor plumbing. Latrines were usually outside or down a drafty corridor. Nighttime trips meant cold stone steps, sputtering candles, and the occasional rat. Most people decided, reasonably, to just use the pot, which meant the smell of a Tudor bedroom wasn't just sweat, wool, and damp straw. It was a faint and inescapable tang of human waste, stewing beneath the bed like a curse no herbal sachet could fully cover. Quirky tidbit? Some Tudors tried to sweeten the pot by adding lavender or rosemary to the bottom. Others, less successfully, added ashes, thinking it would help absorb the odour. It didn't. It just created a sort of medieval barbecue effect. And the interruptions? Endless. If you were a servant or a tenant, people walked through your room constantly. Need to get to the kitchen, through the bedroom, want to reach the stairs. Through the bedroom, looking for the missing cat. That's right, through the bedroom. Doors, if they existed, weren't kept shut. Not because people were rude, but because airflow was considered more important than privacy. A stuffy room was thought to invite illness. A drafty one, merely character building. Even in royal palaces, privacy was an illusion. Courtiers came and went with messages at all hours. Servants bustled in to stoke fires, deliver spiced wine, or remove soiled linens. King Henry VIII himself was rarely alone. He dined, dressed, and sometimes even prayed with company. If he wanted a moment of true intimacy, he had to order it. So you can imagine how ordinary couples fared. One recorded incident from a London townhouse describes a young wife and her husband caught in an intimate moment when the neighbour's child burst in looking for a lost ball. Another mentions a groom climbing into the wrong bed in a shared chamber and not realising it until he'd already warmed the blankets. Oops. Historians still debate whether people even expected privacy or whether they simply learned to function within the noise. Some argue that Tudor intimacy was a matter of timing, not tenderness. You stole a moment where you could, and you laughed about the interruptions later. Or didn't. And then, of course, there's the matter of creaky beds. Most were made of wood, with ropes stretched beneath to support the mattress. Sleep tight comes from the act of tightening these ropes, by the way. But they squeaked, loudly, so even if no one walked in on you, everyone knew what was going on by the rhythm of the furniture. Privacy? Not even close. It's why some couples chose to slip outside into barns or woods, yes, even in the cold. A dark forest was sometimes more discreet than a crowded cottage. Just watch out for foxes. So here you are again, imagining yourself in a cramped attic room, nestled beside someone you trust, the candle flickering low, when suddenly a thud, a cough, and a whispered, "Don't mind me, just need the pot." You pause, you sigh, you wait, because this is the rhythm of Tudor life. Intimacy not as something grand or cinematic, but as something humble, interrupted, messy, real. And yet, people still found ways. They whispered under the covers, they laughed in the face of noise, they tiptoed through quiet mornings, fingers brushing in the dark. Because in a world where even the chamber pot had a role in your love life, the most romantic thing someone could do was give you 5 minutes without scraping it. The mist is curling tighter now, seeping into floorboards, kissing the glass panes with dew. You breathe softly, listening to the distant drip of rainwater from a crooked roof tile. But in your imagination you're following another sound, the rattle of vials, the rustle of pouches, and the low murmur of a woman saying, "Drink this, but not too much." Because tonight we uncork the shadowy world of Tudor love spells and potent potions. Yes, long before dating apps and whispered "I love yous," people tried to manufacture affection with roots, powders, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. Because when love was arranged, sex was painful and privacy a myth. What else could you turn to but magic? Let's begin in the apothecary's back room, dimly lit, stacked with jars labelled in Latin and smudged chalk. Here, nestled among dried foxglove and crushed bones, you'd find the tools of Tudor aphrodisiacs, powdered sheep liver, beetle elixirs, ambergris, musk, and even a few questionable liquids in corked glass. Aphrodisiacs weren't just for the desperate, they were a quiet form of rebellion, a way for women to reassert a sliver of control over their bodies, or for men to boost their confidence in a world where poor hygiene and the looming threat of syphilis tended to kill the mood. One mainstream concoction involved mixing wine with cinnamon, nutmeg, and ground pine nuts. It was supposed to warm the blood and encourage merry company. In reality, it mostly encouraged blushing and bad poetry. But there were darker brews too, remedies promising to ensnare a lover's heart or make them faithful forever. These often included less palatable ingredients: snail slime, dried frog, a lock of hair, menstrual blood. Don't worry, we won't dwell on that last one. But let's just say, if someone offers you wine in Tudor England, maybe ask what's in it. The line between medicine and magic was paper thin. Even reputable physicians, educated Latin-quoting men, might recommend a love draught alongside a bleeding or leeching. Because desire wasn't a simple thing, it was a humor imbalance. Too much heat, too much moisture, too little restraint. Quirky tidbit: one popular love charm involved sewing basil leaves into the hem of your clothing while chanting a rhyme under the waxing moon. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe your beloved just liked basil. And what of the cunning women, the real dealers in hearts and hexes? These weren't your average market vendors. They were midwives, herbalists, healers, and sometimes feared witches, who knew what herbs could slow a womb, stir a passion, or silence a husband's wandering eye. Their knowledge was both sought after and dangerous, because a woman who understood love potions might also understand poisons. Historians still argue whether these women believed in their charms or simply provided comfort wrapped in ritual. Some claim the potions were real, though their effects were probably psychological. Others suggest that Tudor people simply needed something to hope for: a leaf, a prayer, a vial tied with red thread. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the setting. You're a young woman in love with a man promised to another. Or you're a wife long ignored, watching your husband laugh with the new maid. You sneak to the edge of the village, knock 3 times on a crooked door, and whisper your heartache. The woman inside gives you a satchel. Steep this in cider. Say his name once with the steam in your face. Don't look back as you leave. Will it work? You don't know, but in a world where your choices are so limited, even a sliver of control, a drop of something secret, feels like power. Of course, there were risks. Get caught with a potion, and you could be accused of bewitching someone. Marriages annulled, lives upended. One poor girl in Yorkshire was accused of ensnaring a clergyman with a baked apple and a sprig of rosemary. Her crime? Making him forget his vows long enough to kiss her hand. But not all spell work was desperate. Some were playful. Couples exchanged knot charms, ribbons or strings tied in secret ways. Untie the knot, they said, and your heart is mine. There were games played in the dark during festivals, where you tried to divine your future spouse by throwing shoes over barns or sleeping with bay leaves under your pillow. Imagine waking up to a dream of someone holding your hand and believing it was fate. You lie still now, picturing those rituals, the nervous fingers tying knots in candlelight, the heavy scent of rosemary crushed into wine, the ache in someone's chest as they whisper a name into the steam rising from a cup. Tudor England didn't offer many choices in love, but people still found ways to want, to hope, to reach, because maybe it wasn't about the spell, maybe it was about the intention, a moment where you dared to believe that love could be shaped just a little by your own hands. So sleep now, knowing that long before romance novels and dating apps, people were out there mixing herbs, muttering charms, and lighting candles in the dark, hoping for just one look, one word, one chance to be chosen. The rain outside has turned soft now, like fingertips on the roof. But you stay under your covers, barely blinking, because the next part of this story isn't about herbs or whispers or hopeful glances. It's about silence, a sharp, punishing kind, the kind that wraps around your ribs like the stays of a corset. Because in Tudor England, consent wasn't really a concept, not legally, not culturally, not even linguistically. Let's begin with the most basic truth. In this world, a woman's body did not belong to her. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband. If she was unmarried, she belonged to the church or to the gossiping judgment of her parish. At no point was a woman expected to claim ownership of her own desires, only to guard them like a gatehouse under siege. So what did that mean for intimacy? It meant that refusal was rarely an option. Once married, a woman was legally required to make herself available to her husband. Denial could be grounds for accusation of disobedience and of wickedness, even of betrayal. And if she wasn't married and she was coerced, assaulted, or manipulated, the odds of anyone listening were slim. The odds of anyone believing her were even slimmer. One mainstream legal fact: Tudor common law didn't define marital rape as a crime. A husband couldn't violate his wife because her consent was assumed eternally without negotiation and without the need to ask. It sounds brutal. It was brutal. And yet the culture around it was even more insidious. Plays, poems, and ballads often romanticized women being won through persistence, ignoring protests, chasing down refusals, turning no into yes by sheer determination. It wasn't just normalized, it was celebrated. Quirky tidbit: a popular folk tale of the time told of a woman who spurned a suitor until he appeared in her bedchamber disguised as a ghost, kissed her in the dark, and won her heart. Today, that would be the stuff of horror films. In Tudor England, it was a love story. But what about the women? Surely some fought back, protested, tried to reclaim space? They did. Quietly. Through coded language in letters, through warnings passed from mother to daughter, and through the rare act of legal resistance. There are records, rare, precious, of women who stood before church courts and said, "I said no." Most were ignored. Some were punished. A few were believed. Historians still argue how widespread this resistance was. Some believe women simply endured, internalizing their lack of power. Others point to diaries and depositions that suggest a simmering rebellion beneath the surface, one made of refusals, illnesses feigned, and beds kept cold on purpose. And when women were violated outside of marriage, the response often depended not on what happened, but on who she was. A noblewoman might be protected if it served her family's interests. A servant girl, disposable. The burden of proof fell entirely on her, and even then her character would be the first thing on trial. Was she flirtatious? Did she walk alone? Did she wear her cap too loosely? One heartbreaking court record describes a miller's daughter who reported an assault by her employer. The court questioned her late-night chores, her looseness of manner, and ultimately fined her for tempting sin. And men? They were rarely punished unless the victim was connected to someone powerful, or unless a pregnancy made the crime impossible to hide. In those cases, the man might be forced into a hasty marriage, or fined. Execution was rare. Shame? Even rarer. You lie still now, the heaviness of history pressing into your pillow. You wonder how many women lay exactly like this, centuries ago, eyes open, breath held, staring into the dark after a moment they never asked for, never wanted, and could never speak about again. But not all silence was surrender. Some women found their power in refusal. Some refused to marry. Some fled arranged unions. Some, like Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, used marriage as strategy, outlived multiple husbands, and orchestrated political dynasties. And then there were the quiet ones, the seamstress who always worked late, the widow who never remarried, the sister who stood between her sibling and a dangerous match. They left no ballads, but their resistance lives in the margins, scrawled notes, altered wills, a pause in a parish record where a name should be. So you stay tucked in now, holding space for them, for the women who were never asked, who were told their voices didn't matter, and who, in small, stubborn ways, refused to be erased. Because in a world that didn't understand consent, choosing silence was sometimes the only thing left to choose. The rain has faded to a drizzle, and a faint pinkness touches the edges of the sky. But your blanket holds you still, safe, quiet, and out of reach. Because now we're going to trace a path through shame, secrets, and swollen bellies. Because in Tudor England, pregnancy wasn't just risky, it was public, political, and, if you were unmarried, potentially ruinous. You see, the body of a Tudor woman told stories whether she wanted it to or not. And when that body began to change, rounding, shifting, betraying its usual form, everyone noticed. And everyone started asking questions. If you were a married woman, pregnancy was expected. It was, in fact, one of the only socially acceptable reasons for sex. Even then you were watched closely. How soon after the wedding did you begin to show? Was your face flushed or pale? Did you eat pickled fish for breakfast? Even your cravings were dissected by midwives and neighbours alike, each one assigning a gender or a fate to the way you chewed your bread or held your spoon. One mainstream belief, that if you carried high, it was a girl. If you waddled, it was a boy. If your skin glowed, it meant favour from God. If you were too sickly, well, maybe the child was cursed. But if you were unmarried, those same symptoms transformed from signs of joy into proof of sin. The signs of pregnancy in an unmarried woman were a social earthquake. Families were shamed, parish records were updated with trembling ink. And the woman herself? She might be banished, beaten, or dragged before a moral court. And let's be clear, pregnancy out of wedlock was not always a result of love. Many women were pressured, coerced, or assaulted. But none of that mattered to Tudor society. All that mattered was that she had broken the unspoken rule, be invisible or be perfect. The punishment varied by region, but often included public penance. A woman might be forced to stand in front of the church, head bowed, belly covered by a sackcloth smock, while the congregation murmured prayers for her corrupted soul. Imagine being 14, terrified, alone, and being stared at like a walking cautionary tale. Quirky tidbit? In some towns, these women were called leaping girls, referencing the idea that a sudden leap or dance could cause a child to be conceived. It was absurd, and yet used to mock women who became pregnant without the blessing of a marriage contract. And what of the fathers? They were often harder to pin down, unless a woman named a man, and unless he admitted guilt, he could walk away with little more than a scolding. Some were forced into marriage, others simply vanished. And in the worst cases, if the woman refused to name him, or if the pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, she could be accused of infanticide. Yes, truly. If a woman gave birth in secret and the child died, whether naturally or not, she could be tried and executed under suspicion of murder. The Burial of Bastards Act in 1624, not too long after our period, made it clear no witnesses meant presumed guilt. Historians still argue whether these cases were common or just disproportionately documented. Either way, the threat loomed large, and the fear drove women to hide pregnancies, flee their villages, or seek dangerous remedies to end the pregnancy before anyone noticed. Midwives were again at the centre of this crisis. They were expected to monitor unmarried women, report suspicious behaviour, and attend births with a careful eye. But many turned a blind eye, or helped, quietly, carefully, out of compassion, or sisterhood, or perhaps the simple knowledge that next time it could be their daughter. Let's not forget the emotional toll. For women who wanted the child but were denied support, the isolation was unbearable. Some wrote letters begging for mercy. Some left notes in swaddled cloth, tucked into church pews beside abandoned infants. Some wept behind barns, then walked into the woods and never came back. And yet, even amidst this cruelty, there were glimmers of kindness, neighbours who looked the other way, priests who preached forgiveness, even the occasional wealthy patron who took in a disgraced servant and allowed her to raise the child quietly. Small mercies in a sea of judgment. You lie back now, thinking of all those women, holding their swollen bellies in silence, avoiding mirrors, avoiding people, waiting for the moment when their secret became impossible to hide. When they stopped being seen as daughters or sisters and became something else, evidence of failure. But you also think of the strength it took to carry on, to survive not just the pregnancy, but the glare of every eye in the parish, to give birth in the dark, to name the child or not, to stay, because shame is heavy, but so is resilience. And in Tudor England, every woman who walked with her head high, even when the world tried to shrink her down to a mistake, was performing a quiet act of defiance. Dawn is brushing across the horizon now, soft as lye soap on raw hands. But stay where you are, wrapped tight, eyes half closed, because the next part of our Tudor journey takes us into a space that, even today, still feels haunted. You're entering the birthing chamber. It isn't bright. There's no cheerful chirping or soft lullabies, just low whispers, the rustle of linens, and the scent of sweat, blood, beeswax, and fear. Because in Tudor England, childbirth was a dangerous, dimly lit trial, and most women knew they might not survive it. Let's step inside. The birthing room was usually sealed. Men were kept out. Priests might be nearby, but the chamber itself belonged to women, midwives, mothers, neighbours, and the labouring woman herself. The windows were shuttered, the hearth stoked, and candles lit in every corner to keep evil spirits at bay. Yes, spirits. You see, childbirth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual warfare. The pain was believed to be Eve's punishment, a divine sentence passed down through every womb since the Garden of Eden. Women were expected to endure it in silence. Crying out was natural, but screaming too much? A sign of weak faith? One mainstream practice? The birthing girdle. A long strip of parchment or cloth inscribed with prayers and saints' names. Women wrapped it around their waists during labour, hoping it would bring protection and ease. It rarely did. And the midwives, those sturdy, sharp-eyed guardians of life, were equal parts healer and spiritual guide. They held your hands, muttered Latin over your brow, wiped your face with vinegar-soaked cloth, and sometimes whispered last rites between contractions just in case. Quirky tidbit. Some believed that placing a knife beneath the bed would cut the pain or ward off malevolent forces. Others swore by hanging keys, iron rings, or even bits of bread under the mattress. Anything to distract fate. But no charm could change the facts. 1 in 3 women didn't survive childbirth. And if they did, the risk of infection, hemorrhage, or fever lingered for days. She's been delivered was not a celebration. It was just the first checkpoint. The next was surviving the week. The medical knowledge of the time was limited. If the baby was breech, the midwife might try to turn it by hand. If the mother tore, there were no proper stitches, just pressure, herbs, and crossed fingers. If the labour stalled, they prayed, and if it failed, they buried quickly. And the child, not always a victory. If it cried, great. If not, well, it might be rushed to the local priest for emergency baptism, still wet and bluish, wrapped in rags. Some babies lived minutes, others hours. Still they were named, held, mourned. Imagine now a flickering candle guttering as a woman breathes heavily, eyes unfocused, a midwife's hands pressed to her belly, a grandmother clutching a rosary, a basin of blood-stained linens on the floor. No epidural, no sterile gloves, just raw, ancient determination. And the silence afterward? Deafening. Sometimes it meant rest, sometimes it meant death. Historians still argue whether childbirth was more feared than marriage. One chronicler wrote that women entered the church twice in their lives, once in white, to wed, and once in black, to bury a child. But we forget how many entered once and never again. When a woman died in labor, her body was often buried with the infant, regardless of whether the child survived. It was symbolic. One journey, one grave. And if she survived, she remained unclean for weeks until she could be churched, a ritual of purification, as though new life had stained her. Even royalty wasn't spared. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. And though her death was mourned, she was still referred to in court documents as pure, as if the suffering had sanctified her. And yet, despite all this, women did it again and again, out of duty, yes, but also out of hope, out of longing, out of the simple, stubborn desire to create something that might outlive the pain. Some found joy in it. Some joked once the pain passed. Some sang lullabies in cracked voices. Others refused to speak for days. Every experience was different, but all of them were acts of bravery. You lie back now, the candle in your imagined birthing room flickering low. You think of all the women who clenched their teeth and bore down, not knowing what would come next, who whispered names into tiny ears, who named no one at all, who closed their eyes and hoped someone would remember them as more than a vessel. Because in Tudor England, childbirth wasn't just a beginning. It was a gamble, a prayer, and too often, a goodbye. The light outside is pale now, spilling into the room like milk. It brushes the wooden floor, glints off the pewter pitcher on the table, and glows faintly on the edge of a worn cradle. But don't get up yet. Not before we finish this chapter. Because after the candle has burned low, after the child is born, if the mother lives, it doesn't mean peace. No, not in Tudor England. It means a new challenge, caring for the baby with whatever you could find, trust, or afford. Welcome to the uncertain world of wet nurses, rotten remedies, and postnatal guesswork. Let's start at the cradle. It's not padded, it's not pastel. It's a wooden box with curved rockers stuffed with rags and perhaps a thin sheepskin. Maybe you've hung a sprig of rosemary from the handle to ward off bad luck. Maybe the midwife left a charm wrapped in cloth under the mattress, not for decoration, for protection, because you've just survived childbirth, and now the baby must survive too. If you're a wealthy mother, you probably won't be nursing the child yourself. That's for a wet nurse, a woman hired to breastfeed your baby, often for months, sometimes years. She might live with you. She might visit twice a day. You probably don't know her very well, but you rely on her entirely. Mainstream fact, it was common in noble families to hire wet nurses, not just to free the mother from the physical demands of breastfeeding, but also because people believed that a woman's emotional state could poison her milk. If the mother was sad, angry, or sinful, her milk might carry those traits into the baby's soul. So women were screened. Not for diseases, they didn't know how to test that, but for character. A good wet nurse was cheerful, modest, sober, and preferably had a healthy, fat baby of her own. Quirky tidbit. Some Tudor physicians recommended that the wet nurse have red hair, believing it produced more energetic children. Others warned against women with freckles, melancholic temperaments, or an excess of bile. It was part science, part superstition, part very unhelpful guesswork. And what about the babies of poor women? They had to make do. If the mother died or couldn't produce milk, the infant was sometimes fed gruel, mashed bread, or animal milk poured through linen. But these mixtures spoiled quickly, attracted flies, and often made the child sick. There were no bottles, just spoons, or soaked cloth, or the slow trickle of a hollowed-out horn, diapers, cloth rags. If you were lucky, changed rarely, boiled even less. And if the baby fell ill, well, the cures were creative. One remedy for colic was to bake an owl, grind it into powder, and blow it into the baby's mouth. Another advised laying a live eel across the infant's stomach. There were honey salves, mustard poultices, and something truly horrifying called cat grease, rubbed behind the ears to ward off spirits. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Some babies didn't make it to their naming day, others perished from simple fevers. And in the absence of understanding, blame was assigned, sometimes to the mother, sometimes to the wet nurse, occasionally to no one at all. But when things went well, when the child thrived, it was celebrated in quiet ways. A ribbon tied to the cradle, a feast of bread and ale, a whispered blessing from the midwife as she packed her bag and slipped away. And for the mother, no rest. Even after surviving labour, she was expected to be churched, a religious rite that cleansed her after childbirth and allowed her back into society. Until then, she was technically unclean, holy perhaps, but dangerous, touched by blood and mystery. So imagine lying there, nursing your child, half-healed and half-holy, while your husband waits outside the room, and your neighbours whisper about whether the child looks enough like him. Imagine a stranger showing up at your door, asking if your milk has soured. Imagine a priest asking if the baby was born too early. Imagine hiding the pain in your stomach because there's laundry to do, and no one wants to hear about afterbirth. You're strong, but strength doesn't spare you from scrutiny. And still you go on, you sing lullabies in half-remembered Latin, you dip a cloth in warm ale and clean the baby's mouth, you tuck herbs into the mattress, not because you believe in magic, but because you believe in doing something, because in Tudor England, being a mother was a gamble, being a living mother was a rarity, and being a good one? That depended not on instincts or affection, but on how well you navigated the maze of customs, beliefs, and expectations wrapped around your cradle. So you lie here now, listening to the imagined coo of a baby swaddled beside you. The midwife has gone, the candle has burned out, and you've survived, at least today. And for tonight, that's enough. The morning is fully awake now, golden light trickling through the shutters, brushing your cheek like the gentlest of intrusions. But the story isn't done, not yet, because even if a woman had survived the birth, even if the baby cried, and the wet nurse was kind and the chamber quieted, what if the baby never came at all? What if a woman couldn't conceive? In Tudor England, infertility wasn't a shared burden. It was her fault, always. No matter the cause, no matter the whispers, the woman bore the weight. Imagine it. You're married young as expected. You fulfill your duties. Months pass, then years, and still nothing. No swelling belly, no cradle by the hearth, no coos, only questions and stares and the sharp, deliberate silences over dinner. A woman's worth, especially in noble or wealthy households, was often measured in sons, not even children, sons, heirs, titles, land. Without them, a family's entire future could crumble. And if she failed to provide one, that wasn't a personal tragedy, it was a political disaster. One mainstream reality. Catherine of Aragon spent more than 2 decades as Queen of England and gave birth to 6 children. Only one, Mary, survived. Her inability to produce a male heir became Henry VIII's excuse to divorce her, sever ties with the Catholic Church, and launch the English Reformation. It changed history, and yet modern scholars believe the issue may have been Henry himself. Poor health, genetic factors. But back then, that wasn't even considered. The man was the seed, the woman was the soil. If nothing grew, it was the earth's fault. This metaphor dominated both religious and medical thinking. Tudor physicians believed a woman's womb could be too cold, too wet, too dry, or too lazy. Treatments included herbal tonics, mustard plasters, leeching, fumigation, and, yes, shoving perfumed wool soaked in wine into the vagina. Delightful. Quirky tidbit, one cure involved placing a live puppy against the belly to draw out stagnation. Another advised the woman to drink the milk of a mare that had recently foaled, ideally under a full moon. If that failed, there was always prayer. Lots and lots of prayer. But none of these remedies helped with the other symptoms of infertility, the whispers, the cold glances, the sudden absences from family events. Servants exchanged looks, mothers-in-law grew impatient. Husbands, well, some strayed, others remarried, and some simply grew distant, as though the empty cradle cast a shadow between them. Historians still debate how much agency women had in these situations. Noble women especially had few options. Divorce was nearly impossible, unless initiated by the man. An adoption, not a concept. If a noblewoman couldn't conceive, she might instead raise a relative's child, quietly, unofficially. But it didn't change how others saw her. And the poor, if they couldn't have children, they faced a different kind of isolation. In a society where children were often the only support system in old age, infertility meant not just sorrow but fear. Who would care for you when you were too old to work? Who would bury you? Who would remember you? You lie still now, imagining a woman sitting by her hearth, hands folded in her lap, watching neighbours pass with children in tow. Imagining the ache that no one saw, or pretended not to. Some tried to cover the pain. They sewed baby gowns in for the future. They kept cradles in storage. Some made dolls of straw and whispered lullabies into the rafters. Others broke. And yet there were moments of tenderness. A husband who held his wife's hand and said, "We are enough." A midwife who gently suggested herbs for peace, not conception. A priest who blessed the marriage regardless. Because even in a world obsessed with heirs and lineages, some people understood that love was not measured in swaddling cloth and tiny shoes. Still, society didn't forgive easily. A woman who couldn't bear children was often cast as incomplete, or worse, suspicious. Some were accused of sorcery, others of unnatural sin, and the most tragic, those who were perfectly fertile but whose husbands were not. Yet, who took the blame without protest because to say otherwise was unthinkable. So you stay curled now, feeling the weight of a history built on expectations women never asked for. You think of all those who waited for something that never came, who lit candles every month, who smiled when asked, "Any news?" who stayed silent when the answer was always no. Because in Tudor England, infertility wasn't a medical condition, it was a condemnation. And yet, despite it, women carried on, held their heads high, sewed hope into every hem, and whispered, in quiet rebellion, "I am still here." The morning is stretching now, warm and golden across the thatch and timber. Somewhere a rooster gives a belated crow and the village stirs. But we stay here, unmoving, because the next place we're going is nowhere near quiet. It's the beating heart of Tudor gossip, scandal, and reputation, the royal court, where every glance, every touch, every rumour had weight. Tonight, or rather this early Tudor morning, you enter the dizzying world of court gossip and bedroom betrayals. Because in this world, love wasn't just private, it was public currency. Every flirtation was a wager, every dalliance a potential disaster. And a misplaced letter, it could ruin lives. Let's set the scene. You're walking through Hampton Court Palace, perhaps. There's music drifting from the great hall, fabric rustling along flagstone, and the sharp scent of rosewater and sweat. You pass noblemen whispering in alcoves, women adjusting their French hoods in polished pewter mirrors, and pages scampering with trays of marchpane and spiced wine. But no one's really thinking about the food. They're thinking about who smiled at whom, and what that smile meant. One mainstream fact, the Tudor court ran on favour, not merit. You got ahead by catching a royal eye, or by knowing someone who had. This meant that personal relationships were everything, and that meant sex, real or suspected, could either crown you or crush you. Enter the game of courtly love. It wasn't supposed to be consummated. That would ruin it. No, the whole thing was built on longing, admiration, and just enough ambiguity to be dangerous. A married nobleman might write a poem to a queen's maid of honour. A lady might wear a token from a man she hardly knew. Everyone saw, everyone interpreted, and if you were actually involved in something secret, you had better be very, very good at keeping secrets, or not have any secrets at all, because servants talked, pages peeked through curtains, maids overheard whispers, and those stories travelled fast. One jest from the wrong tongue could become a scandal by sunset, and once your name was caught in that current, good luck swimming free. Quirky tidbit, one court lady, rumoured to have favoured 3 different suitors, became the subject of an anonymous ballad that that was sung, very badly, by drunk courtiers at a 12th night feast. Her family married her off to a cousin in Wales before the next sunrise. The Tudors didn't have tabloid papers, but they had something worse, letters, piles of them, scrawled in ink, sealed with wax, passed hand to hand under cloaks tucked into books or smuggled in sweetmeats. Many of these survive. Some are beautiful, others are disastrous. One particularly infamous letter, preserved only because it was intercepted, reads, "I kissed thy token so often I feared to rub the thread thin." Romantic? Maybe. Fodder for a political opponent? Definitely. And the betrayal? It wasn't always about sex. Sometimes it was about information. A lover might share secrets of court plans, royal moods, or military movements. It wasn't just pillow talk, it was espionage with better lighting. Historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn was the victim of such a trap. Accused of adultery with multiple men, some of whom were close friends of the king, her downfall was rapid, brutal, and publicly humiliating. To this day, scholars debate whether any of it was true. What's certain is that rumour made it fatal, and in less royal circles, betrayals still stung. A maid dismissed for being too familiar with her master, a betrothal broken after whispered doubts about virtue, a sister accused of stealing a suitor. Love was personal, but gossip was communal. Even music carried secrets. Lute songs were filled with coded messages about longing, betrayal, scandal. One popular tune, "Go From My Window," was reportedly sung by a jilted courtier after catching his lover in the arms of someone else, possibly his cousin. You lie there now, imagining the ripple of whispers through a banquet hall, a head turning too quickly, a smirk over a goblet, a lady's hand twitching ever so slightly when the wrong man enters the room. You think about how exhausting it must have been, how dangerous. To live in a place where your reputation walked 2 steps ahead of you and your heart, if it misfired, might drag your name through the tapestries and down the muddy lane outside the palace gate. And yet, some loved deeply. Some found real connection amidst the schemes. There are letters full of laughter, inside jokes, mentions of stolen apples and long walks by candlelight. Not every relationship was a weapon, some were lanterns in the dark. So you drift now, holding that contradiction close. In Tudor England, love was a game played with veils, glances and ink. It could elevate you to the Queen's ear or send you to the scaffold, and yet people kept writing, kept meeting, kept daring to feel, because even when the walls had ears, the heart never stopped whispering. The sun is fully up now, casting thin gold across the floorboards, but your eyes stay half-lidded. You're not ready to rise. Not yet. Not when the next story weaves through shadows and secrets, one that very few dared to tell aloud in Tudor England, because now you're stepping quietly into the hushed, hidden world of same-sex love, where every touch had to be calculated and every affection could be dangerous. In a world where marriage was survival, heterosexual unions were expected, not necessarily cherished, but required. But desire, that wandered. And sometimes it wandered into places Tudor society didn't want to acknowledge. And so we arrive at the lives of men and women who loved in the shadows. There were no public identities, no categories, no parades, no names for what you were feeling, only whispers, only acts. And when those acts were discovered, the consequences were swift and cruel. One mainstream fact, sodomy was punishable by death. The Buggery Act of 1533, passed under Henry VIII, made unnatural acts between men a capital crime. The law was vague on purpose, allowing for wide interpretation. Its true intent? Control. But the law wasn't always enforced. Some accusations were pursued out of malice, by neighbours settling scores or rivals in court. Others were quietly ignored so long as no one made too much noise. Historians still argue how common same-sex relationships were in Tudor England. The records are murky, partly because few dared write openly, and partly because later archivists erased what they didn't understand. But fragments remain, letters, poems, court records, the odd snatch of diary hastily crossed out. Quirky tidbit? A 1580 pamphlet described two women in Devon who had been living as husband and wife for years, until one was discovered wearing men's clothing and performing husbandly duties. They were arrested, tried, and, according to the record, never heard from again. In some noble households, male friendships blurred into intimacy. Letters between men spoke of sleeping in the same bed, of embracing, of joy at your return that fills me to breaking. Was it romantic? Possibly. Was it coded affection made safe by metaphor? Likely. And women? Their stories were even harder to trace, because women were expected to be affectionate, to hug, to weep together, to write long, flowery letters. It gave cover. But when that affection crossed into desire, the danger remained. One case in the early 1600s, close enough to count, described two serving women discovered kissing most familiarly. They were dismissed from their household and disappeared from the record. No trial, just silence. You lie here, imagining the lives behind those silences. Two women sharing a mattress in a shared attic room, their fingers brushing beneath the covers. Two men pressed shoulder to shoulder behind a tavern, sharing a joke louder than necessary to cover the way their knees touch. They weren't rebels, they weren't saints, they were just people trying to hold on to something warm in a world that offered so little space for anything unscripted. Even plays, so rich in double meaning, offered glimpses. In Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Viola disguises herself as a man and wins the affection of Olivia. In As You Like It, Rosalind woos Orlando while also dressed as a man. The audiences laughed, but perhaps some looked twice. Did the actors know? Did the writers? Was it a joke or a nod? Perhaps both. And let's not forget the danger. Accusations of sodomy weren't always about sex. Sometimes they were about power. Discrediting a rival, shaming a household, just the hint of such behavior could ruin a man, even if unproven. So if you loved someone of your own sex, you kept it quiet. You met in the woods, you stayed up late when the others had gone to sleep. You passed letters inside books, you never said it aloud, but you felt it, and sometimes that was enough. You lie there now, picturing someone brushing a strand of hair behind another's ear. Just once. Just fast enough that no one could notice, just long enough that the memory would last forever. Not every love story is written in ink. Some are scratched into beams in attics, folded into hymnals, hidden in plain sight. In Tudor England, same-sex love was unspeakable. But that didn't mean it was unfelt. The hush has returned now, just beneath the birdsong, steady, unbothered, like it always is after a secret has been shared. But as you rest, let's slip into another hush of a different kind. The silence after abandonment, the space left behind when someone steps out the door and never comes back. Tonight, or still this morning for us, you enter the lonely echo of widowhood, desertion, and the ruinous ripple of scandal. You'd think that in a world where marriage was so heavily enforced, where love was traded like land and honor, it'd be unthinkable to just walk away. But people did. Not often, but they did. And when they did, it caused shockwaves. Let's begin with a widow, a respectable station, right? In theory. She's draped in black, a white linen coif wrapped tightly around her head, her eyes rimmed with red. Not necessarily from grief, but from the weight of what comes next. Because being a widow wasn't romantic, it wasn't empowering, it was precarious. Without a husband, a woman's place in Tudor society was unstable. She had no legal identity of her own. Everything she owned was either returned to her husband's family or fiercely contested. Mainstream fact, widows could own property, but only if it was specifically left to them in a will or protected by a dowry clause. And even then, disputes were common. Brothers-in-law, uncles, even sons could challenge her rights. Some widows remarried quickly, not out of love, but survival. Others resisted, clinging fiercely to what autonomy they had left. A few, very few, managed to run businesses, inns, or small farms on their own, but the road was uphill, steep, and paved with male suspicion. And then there were the deserted wives, still married, but utterly alone. Quirky tidbit: one 1590s case tells of a London cooper who vanished suddenly, leaving behind a wife and 5 children. She sold his tools to survive and was then charged with theft, because technically the goods were still his. They never found him, but she paid the price. Desertion wasn't common, but when it happened, it created legal chaos. Women weren't allowed to remarry unless the husband was officially declared dead, a process that could take 7 years, and even then, only under very particular conditions. So imagine this: your husband vanishes. No letter, no goodbye, just gone. Maybe he went off with another woman. Maybe he died in a ditch somewhere. Maybe he just started over in another county. You're left behind with the debt, the children, and the neighbours peeking through curtains. And Tudor neighbours? Never subtle. You might be accused of driving him away, of being barren, of being cursed. Some women in these situations were branded scolds, a formal term for troublesome women. Public punishments followed: the scold's bridle, a heavy iron muzzle with a sharp bit placed in the mouth, used to silence and shame. And scandal? That didn't just knock politely, it kicked down doors. Say you're a married woman, abandoned, but technically not single. And one night, after too much ale and too much loneliness, you're seen entering a neighbour's cottage. That neighbour happens to be a man. 2 days later, a constable arrives. You're accused of living in sin. Historians still argue whether Tudor communities were truly as punitive as court records make them seem. Some suggest village life was more forgiving. People looked the other way when needed. Others insist the surveillance was constant and the punishments swift. And what of the children? Born out of wedlock or left behind by deserting fathers? Many were deemed illegitimate. That label stuck. It followed them into apprenticeships, into courtship, into their own marriages. Church registers marked them with special ink. Parish relief funds avoided them. And some, heartbreakingly, were left at the doors of monasteries or on church steps in the dead of night, wrapped in old cloaks with a prayer and nothing else. But not all stories end in sorrow. Some widows defied expectations. They refused to remarry. They reclaimed land. They ran alehouses, raised sons to be constables and daughters to be midwives. They became the wise women at the edge of the village, the ones people feared a little, but always turned to when illness came. You lie still now, picturing a woman standing at her doorway, her apron stiff with flour, her eyes lined with years, her hand resting on the frame, not to steady herself, but to show she owns it. Not just the building, the space, the story. Because even when the world wrote her off, she kept writing herself back in. The air is still now, save for the faint creak of floorboards in your imagination, echoes of feet long gone. You stay wrapped in your blanket, cocooned in thought, as we step into a darker, more tangled corridor of Tudor life, the punishment of pleasure and how the state turned private acts into public shaming. Because while desire existed, as it always has, the Tudors weren't especially kind to those who indulged in it beyond the lines drawn by church, court, and crown. And oh, those lines were everywhere. Tonight you'll walk into a world where pleasure was suspicious. A moral panic could land you in the stocks. Let's begin in the village square. There's a woman standing on a platform, a paper sign hung around her neck. Her cheeks are flushed, not from shame, but from the egg hurled by a local child. She's been convicted of lewd behaviour. That might mean she was seen kissing someone not her husband, or that she wore her coif a little too far back. Or maybe she was just loud and unmarried. That was often enough. One mainstream fact: Tudor moral courts, often called ecclesiastical courts, had jurisdiction over all things indecent. They handled fornication, adultery, bastardy, and even gossip. Yes, gossip was a punishable offence. You might be hauled in simply for being suspected of a late-night tryst or for bearing a child out of wedlock. And if the court believed you guilty, fines, whippings, public penance. Quirky tidbit? In some parishes, the guilty were made to stand at the front of church on Sunday, barefoot and in a shift, reciting scripted apologies while neighbours stared. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was humiliation, a community cleansing ritual, if you will. Men weren't exempt. A man caught visiting a prostitute could face a similar fate, though let's be honest, women bore the brunt, always. Double standards were Tudor law, not just practice. Historians still argue whether these courts genuinely curbed behaviour or just pushed it deeper underground. Some records suggest a sort of resigned participation. People confessed, were punished, then went on their way. Others show lives shattered by a single accusation. And speaking of accusations, let's visit the brothels. Yes, they existed, often clustered in regulated areas known as liberties, zones technically outside city control, like Southwark across the Thames from London proper. These areas were strange hybrids, allowed by the Crown, policed by the Church, and sustained by demand. One well-known brothel district was owned, ironically, by the Bishop of Winchester. The prostitutes who worked there were called Winchester geese. Charming, isn't it? Though they weren't protected, far from it. They were taxed, restricted, controlled. And when their health declined, as it often did, they were discarded. Some were buried in unconsecrated ground, especially in places like Crossbones Graveyard, where the forgotten went. The double irony? The very men who condemned them by day visited them by night. And if you were a woman forced into sex work, no one asked why. Poverty, abuse, abandonment, none of it mattered. You were labelled. And once labelled, the stain remained. Imagine it now. You walk down a London alley. A lantern flickers. A woman sits beneath a window, arms wrapped around her knees. A man passes, doesn't even glance. She watches the cobblestones. Her shift is torn. Her hair, once neatly braided, is a tangle. And the worst part, she's still judged more harshly than the man who paid her. Even within marriage, pleasure was policed. Too much intimacy? Suspicious. Laughing too loudly in bed? Suspicious. A woman seen enjoying herself during sex? Highly suspicious. There were even punishments for excessive lust within a legal union. If a couple was considered too intimate, especially if they ignored fasting days or church bans on certain unclean times, they could be summoned. Yes, you could get in trouble for enjoying your spouse too much, because this wasn't about morality, it was about control. So here you are now, curled under covers, letting your breath even out, thinking about all those who were punished, not for cruelty or crime, but for feeling too deeply, for loving inconveniently, for seeking comfort in a world that didn't offer much. You don't condone every act, of course, but you understand the loneliness, the hunger for connection, the desperate need to be touched, seen, chosen, even briefly. And you realize that in Tudor England, pleasure wasn't sinful because it was dangerous. It was sinful because it was free, because it reminded people that they still had something the system couldn't own, so they punished it. But it never disappeared, because behind every cold edict and bristle of birch, someone was still whispering, "I love you." The sky in your mind is soft grey now, like old linen, and the wind outside your imaginary window sighs against the shutters. We've walked through punishments, scandals, secrets and shadows, but now let's peer into something more mundane, and yet equally revealing. Tonight, you wake slowly in a small, smokish room, your head still heavy with the dreams of another life. You stretch and settle deeper into your blanket as we drift into the quiet discomfort of married life in Tudor England. It wasn't all poetry and peril. Sometimes it was just tedious. You've probably heard that marriages back then were political contracts. That's true, especially among the wealthy. But even in the lower classes, marriage was more about function than romance. You were expected to labour together, raise children, and avoid scandal. And if a little affection bloomed along the way, lucky you. One mainstream fact, the average age of marriage for women in Tudor England was around 25. Men often married even later, closer to 28 or 30. That's older than many assume. But people waited. Why? Because they needed money, land, or a stable job, before they could set up a household. That household, small, crowded, often shared with in-laws, privacy, laughable. You lie there now listening to the scratch of mice behind the wattle walls, the snore of a father-in-law on the other side of a thin timber partition. You wonder how newlyweds ever found a moment alone. Let's not sugarcoat it. Marital intimacy wasn't always joyful. In many cases it was a duty, scheduled, expected, and rarely discussed. Women were expected to submit, men were expected to perform, and if either party failed, well, things got complicated. Quirky tidbit: there are recorded court cases where women sued their husbands for failure to fulfill marital duty. One woman even presented a wooden object in court to demonstrate her husband's inadequacy, an early form of legal dramatization, perhaps. On the flip side, some men accused wives of withholding affection, a euphemism used in church courts for anything from emotional coldness to refusal of intimacy. These cases weren't just embarrassing, they could lead to public penance or even annulment. And still somehow couples endured. Historians still argue whether emotional intimacy was common in Tudor marriages. Letters suggest a spectrum. Some couples exchanged tender notes and tokens, while others seem to operate more like co-workers who happen to share a bed. You picture it now, a wife stoking the hearth while her husband sharpens a blade. They don't speak, but there's a rhythm to it, a mutual endurance, a dance choreographed by repetition. Children often came quickly and frequently. A woman might bear a dozen or more in her lifetime, though many would not survive infancy. Each birth was a gamble, each pregnancy a physical and emotional marathon. And yet the couple pressed on, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes with clenched jaws and separate pillows. Infidelity existed, of course, as did suspicion, jealousy, boredom, resentment, but so did shared labor, shared grief, and in rare cases love that deepened with every harvest and holy day. One tale tells of a couple married 40 years in Wiltshire. She brewed ale, he delivered it. Their neighbours called them the laughing pair. When she died, he wore her apron for weeks in her memory. He said it still smelled of thyme. You smile faintly now, imagining that kind of quiet devotion. Nothing grand, just steady. Like a fire that never flares, but also never dies. And in between all the hardship, there were moments, soft ones, a husband saving the last bit of honey for his wife, a wife mending a doublet with a patch of embroidered cloth, too pretty for utility but stitched in anyway. A shared joke as they swept ashes from the hearth, the way he touched her elbow as he passed. No court records mention those things, but they existed, they had to, because even in a world built on duty and silence, affection found a way. So tonight, as you lie still under your covers, think of all those quiet marriages, not dramatic, not epic, but real, full of sighs and compromises and clumsy kisses after candlelight. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. You're sinking even deeper now, the warmth of your blanket curling around your knees like a second skin. Outside your mind's window, the Tudor sky is dark again, stars glinting like hammered pewter. You're almost asleep, but not quite, which is perfect, because we're about to wander into one of the strangest alleys of the age. Tonight, you shuffle softly into the world of magical protections, fertility charms, and bizarre Tudor bedroom superstitions. Because let's face it, when you live in a time where medicine is garlic paste and mercury, you tend to get creative with problem solving, especially when it comes to the mysteries of sex, pregnancy, and pleasure. You begin, as always, in the dim light of a candle stub. A woman leans over her hearth, whispering into the steam of a herbal brew. Behind her, dried bundles of rue and rosemary hang from blackened rafters. Beneath her tongue, a charm written on vellum, folded small, tucked into her bodice, close to the heart. One mainstream fact: folk medicine and spiritual belief were deeply intertwined in Tudor England. While physicians might quote Galen or scribble Latin, the common people relied on herbalists, midwives, and wise women. These figures offered healing, but also hope. And hope, in the bedroom, was in high demand. Let's say you're a young wife. It's been a year and still no child. Your neighbours whisper. Your mother-in-law clicks her tongue. The pressure mounts. So you slip away one morning to visit the village healer. She gives you a charm, stitched into linen meant to be worn at night. You're told to place it under your pillow while reciting a rhyme. Something about St. Margaret, or maybe a full moon. The instructions are vague, but comforting. Quirky tidbit. One popular remedy for infertility was to urinate on barley grains for several days. If the seeds sprouted quickly, you were fertile. If not, well, perhaps your humours were misaligned. Better eat more cooked leeks. And speaking of food, certain dishes were thought to increase desire. Oysters were one, nutmeg was another. But the top of the list, quince paste, sticky, perfumed and expensive. Wealthy Tudor lovers gifted it like chocolate, though to be fair it was also prescribed for dysentery, so dual purpose. Historians still argue about the boundary between belief and performance in Tudor magic. Some claim people truly believed in the power of charms. Others suggest the rituals were more psychological, a placebo, a ritualized comfort in a world with no answers. One thing's certain, magic was deeply gendered. Women carried amulets to ward off miscarriages, often sewn into the linings of their shifts. Men, meanwhile, might carry charms carved with alchemical symbols meant to increase virility. One surviving example includes a detailed drawing of, well, let's just say, an anatomically confident figure, accompanied by the phrase, "Be proud in the night." Another charm, from a 16th century manuscript, instructed the reader to recite the names of 3 obscure saints backward while holding their breath. This, allegedly, would cure impotence or cause fainting.
Hard to say. You shift under your blanket now, wondering if anyone ever did these things seriously. But they did. Over and over. Because in a world where sex was dangerous, control felt like magic. And when it came to childbirth, the stakes were even higher. Pregnant women often wore birthing girdles, long strips of parchment or cloth inscribed with prayers and symbols. These were wrapped around the belly during labour. Some had been blessed by priests. Others were passed down from mother to daughter, worn soft by generations of pain. One such girdle still survives. It's covered in crosses, saints' names, and a large image of the Lamb of God, carefully inked with red ochre. Some of the writing is faded, but the message is clear. Protect her. Please, just let her survive. Even the layout of a bedroom might follow magical thinking. Bedposts tied with rosemary, a knife under the mattress to ward off evil spirits, a sprig of holly above the door. And in one recorded case, a clove of garlic hidden in a husband's shoe meant to anchor his affection. Did it work? Who knows, but the shoe probably smelled memorable. So now, as your breathing slows and your muscles soften, imagine lying in a narrow Tudor bed, hemmed in by scratchy wool blankets and wooden slats. You've whispered a prayer, you've tucked your charm beneath your pillow, you've eaten your quince paste and rubbed marjoram behind your ears. Outside, an owl calls. Inside, the candle flickers. And you wonder, just for a moment, if all these small rituals might really be keeping you safe. You're not so different, you know. Even now we clutch routines and symbols, a favourite pillow, a bedtime song, a whispered hope into the dark. Because whether it's 2025 or 1525, everyone's just looking for a little comfort in the night. By now your limbs are heavy, your eyelids soft. But your mind is still quietly wandering, trailing fingers along the dusty spines of forgotten stories. Let's take one more turn before you drift off completely into something at once so ordinary and yet so mysterious in Tudor England, the female body and all the strange, sacred and skewed ways it was misunderstood. Tonight, you curl deeper into your blanket as we explore the biology according to Tudor belief. How a woman's body was interpreted, feared, and often blamed for everything. Start with a basic truth. Tudor science wasn't exactly scientific. One mainstream fact. Much of Tudor understanding of anatomy came from ancient Roman texts, especially those by Galen, who believed women were essentially inverted men. Yes, truly. The idea was that women had all the same organs as men, just tucked inside due to their colder, moister nature. Let that sink in. You were cold and damp, like a sponge or a mushroom, very flattering. This belief shaped almost everything: how doctors diagnosed illness, how they prescribed treatments, how they understood reproduction. If a woman had irregular periods, her humours were unbalanced, too much sadness, probably a wandering womb. Yes, the womb was believed to wander. That's your quirky tidbit. For centuries, it was thought that the uterus could literally move around your body like a restless animal. If it strayed too far, say, up toward the throat, it could cause choking, hysteria, or even death.
The cure? Fragrant herbs near the nose to lure it back down, or foul-smelling ones at the feet to drive it away from the lungs. A sort of uterine pest control, if you will. But the confusion didn't stop there. Female anatomy was taboo, rarely drawn, rarely dissected, rarely discussed outside of whispers and midwives. Most men, even educated physicians, had no first-hand understanding, which led to wild speculation. Historians still argue whether this ignorance was willful or just systemic. Some suggest that male doctors deliberately excluded female experience to maintain control. Others believe they genuinely didn't know, and that the barriers to knowledge were simply too high. Either way, women bore the cost. When a woman fell ill, it was often chalked up to her nature, her emotions, her uterus. Melancholy, for example, was treated with purges and bloodletting, or leeches placed delicately near the thighs, because, of course, the problem was internal, always. And when it came to pleasure, well, that was even more complicated. It was widely believed that both men and women had to reach climax for conception to occur, which bizarrely meant that a woman's pleasure was necessary, at least on paper. But in practice, few cared whether she actually did. The contradiction hung in the air like wood smoke. In court, a woman might be shamed for enjoying herself too much, or accused of infertility if she didn't. A tidy double bind. There were even theories that a woman could become pregnant if she experienced pleasure during a violent act, leading to deeply harmful legal precedents. We won't dwell too long on those tonight because your sleep should be soft, not bitter. But remember, in this era, misunderstanding was often more dangerous than cruelty, and ignorance was dressed up in robes and called truth. You turn slightly now, adjusting your pillow, imagining what it might feel like to live in a body you didn't fully understand. To have pain no one believed, to feel desire no one discussed, to be told your womb was unruly and your blood unstable. And yet, women endured. They sought out midwives, whispered advice, and shared knowledge under linen canopies and behind garden hedges. They learned from each other. They watched their mothers. They listened to their neighbors. And slowly, quietly, they built their own medical network, one rooted in herbs, intuition, and resilience. One woman might learn how to ease menstrual cramps with mugwort. Another might carry dried pennyroyal in her pocket to avoid pregnancy. A third might whisper the signs of early labor to her sister, her fingers tight around a woven cord. Even in the absence of formal education, they adapted. Because the body insists on being known, even when the world insists on keeping it secret. So, here you are now, knowing more than they did, but still asking many of the same questions. Still navigating a body that feels sometimes like a mystery, sometimes like home. And as you breathe in and out, slow and steady, maybe you feel a little gratitude for their endurance, for their stubborn curiosity, for the way they carved understanding out of silence. The female body was never truly a puzzle. It was just a book no one bothered to read. But now you've opened it.
And you're not alone. You're almost there now, drifting, floating, that pleasant blur between thought and dream. But there's one final shadow to explore before we reach the hush at the end of the Tudor hall. Tonight, we linger among the whispers of disease and death, not in the terrifying sense, but in the way these ever-present forces shaped how people viewed intimacy, marriage, and morality. Because in Tudor England, sex wasn't just risky, it could be fatal. You lie still, the edges of your blanket tucked up just beneath your chin. Imagine candlelight flickering against plaster walls, the soft hiss of a rushlight near the bed. You're in London now, or maybe York. Either way, a city breathing with the fog of too many bodies and not enough fresh air. And somewhere nearby, a rumour spreads. Someone has the French pox. One mainstream fact, the French pox was the Tudor term for syphilis, and it terrified people. It arrived in England in the late 15th century, likely brought back by soldiers or sailors. By the time Henry VIII took the throne, it was already rampant and highly misunderstood. There were no tests, no antibiotics, and no real sympathy for the afflicted. What did they do instead? Oh, just rub mercury ointment into open sores and hope for the best. Patients were often wrapped in blankets and sweated in hot rooms like poisoned laundry. Unsurprisingly, many didn't survive the treatment, let alone the disease. You shift slightly now, wincing in imagined discomfort. But even more terrifying than the illness itself was the stigma. Those infected were viewed as morally corrupt, punished not just by nature, but by God. It was believed that contracting the pox was a sign of sexual sin, and sufferers were often cast out, hidden away, or subjected to public penance. And that's your quirky tidbit. There were special hospitals for syphilitics, but they often kept patients shackled to their beds, not to prevent escape, but to discourage physical contact. Even among the sick, desire was feared. Historians still argue whether the pox reshaped public policy or simply reinforced existing fears about sex. Some suggest it intensified the church's hold over morality. Others believe it merely gave people one more reason to point fingers. Either way, it darkened the beds of many, but the French pox wasn't the only threat. Pregnancy, too, loomed large. In an era without modern hygiene, childbirth was deadly, for both mother and child. A woman giving birth knew she might not survive the day, and yet she was expected to try again and again until her body gave out or the line was secured. The ritual before birth often included the churching ceremony, a kind of spiritual cleansing offered to new mothers. Though it was framed as a blessing, it subtly implied that birth made a woman spiritually unclean. Imagine going through excruciating labor and then being told you needed purifying. That alone could give you cramps. And if a woman died, she was buried quickly, wrapped in a linen shroud, her hair combed one final time. Sometimes, if the baby lived, it was placed beside her, tiny fingers curled against still skin. And yet, people kept loving. They kept touching, hoping, risking, because desire doesn't wait for perfect safety. It never has. Even in a world where a kiss might bring disease, or a pregnancy might bring death, people still reached for one another in the dark. You soften now, sinking further into that thought, the fragility of it all, the bravery. A couple curled up in a straw-filled mattress, not knowing if this night might be their last. A man writing a love note with shaking hands, knowing he's already sick. A woman singing to her unborn child, not knowing if she'll meet them. Even Queen Elizabeth, who never married, kept portraits of her courtiers. Some say she loved Robert Dudley. Others say she loved power more, but still. She wore rings etched with his initials. She kept his last letter in a locked drawer until her death. Maybe that's love too, risky, private, undone by time, but never meaningless. So as your thoughts grow slower, thicker, heavier, picture them all, the ones who risked, the ones who whispered promises between chapel bells and plague warnings, the ones who reached out anyway, not because they were reckless, but because they were human. This is the end now in every sense. You've walked all the winding Tudor alleys, stepped through candle-lit corridors and cold stone cloisters, ducked into linen-draped bedchambers, and tiptoed through scandal, silence, and superstition. Your breath is deep. Your thoughts are drifting. But before you fall fully into sleep, let's take one last hushed moment in the stillness. Tonight you sit on the edge of a quiet field just outside a Tudor village. It's dusk.
The horizon melts into blue-grey brushstrokes. A few sheep stir in the grass, their bells soft like lullabies. The church bell has long since rung its last hour, and not even the dogs bark anymore. And in a cottage nearby, two people lie side by side in silence. They are not kings, they are not famous. They're no one you've read about. But their lives were just as real. Perhaps they met at a feast or after harvest. Perhaps their hands touched when they reached for the same jug. Maybe they laughed, maybe not. But eventually, they married, and now their heads rest on straw-stuffed pillows pressed into the weight of woolen blankets, the scent of ash and sweat and time all around them. They've known the rules, they've heard the warnings, they understand the danger. And yet here they are, because even in Tudor England, especially in Tudor England, people craved connection. One mainstream fact, despite the hardships, many couples did find joy. Court records, letters, even burial inscriptions tell stories of mutual respect and affection. Some men left land to their wives despite pressure not to. Some women defended their husbands in court despite accusations. These weren't grand gestures, but they were real. Your quirky tidbit? In a few parishes, it was customary for couples to sleep in truckle beds, narrow pull-out beds tucked beneath the master bed, so they could quietly sneak into each other's space at night without scandal. Historians still argue whether love as we understand it today existed in Tudor marriages. Was it duty, habit, strategy? Or was it the same thing we feel now, just cloaked in different clothes and spoken in hushed tones by firelight? You may never know for sure. But maybe it doesn't matter, because tonight you've wandered through their world, and it's quieter than you expected. Rougher, yes, riskier, certainly, but also human, awkward, frightened, hopeful, and so very, very sleepy. Now everything slows. Your thoughts, like old shutters, gently creak closed. The air around you is still. The world feels heavier, but soft. You're safe, you're warm. And the people you've visited, those half-forgotten figures in their rough linen and ironed wool, they're fading now, retreating back into the candle-lit pages of history where they belong. There's nothing more to uncover tonight. No more old remedies. No more whispered prayers. No more nights spent staring at the rafters, wondering if the baby will survive, or if your secret will be discovered, or if the French pox has come for you after all. That was their burden, not yours. All you have to do now is let go. Let go of the worry, the names, the places, the cold timber floors, and the strange, winding ideas of medicine and morality and marriage. Let it all dissolve like steam into the night. Breathe slower now, in, then out, again and again. Feel the weight of your blanket, the way your spine sinks into the mattress, the soft hum of stillness that begins to fill the room, like a lullaby made of silence. In your mind, a single candle still flickers on a worn wooden table, but even that is starting to fade. The flame grows smaller, the shadows fold inward, and everything begins to blur like the final words of a long, long story. The hearth has gone cold, but you're not cold. You're wrapped in the echoes of history. You're safe here, tucked between memory and dream. You made it through, and now you sleep.